1809 once more found France at war with Austria, with the main events taking place along the Danube River. Taken as a whole, the campaign is arguably Napoleon's final victorious one, though it did include his first definite major reverse and clear defeat as emperor at the Battle of Aspern-Essling. However, the attention of this video is once again upon Marshal Bernadotte, whose conduct throughout the campaign, and in particular during the giant two-day Battle of Wagram, once more garnered him both attention and criticism. His involvement in the battle itself is immortalised by one of the era's most famous memoir writers, Captain Marbeau, who wrote that when the Marshal's corps of Saxons were retreating headlong from their position in the centre of the line, Bernadotte, upon trying to rally them, bumped into a frustrated and angry Napoleon, who, Marbeau claims, uttered the following: "I remove you, sir, from the command of the army corps you handle so badly. A bungler like you is no good to me." As dramatic as this may seem, it is unfortunately a myth, for although Bernadotte and Napoleon did have a verbal exchange when they met during this moment of crisis, Bernadotte's removal from command did not take place until several days after the battle, and it had little to do with his battlefield performance. Therefore, in the following video, we will trace Bernadotte's involvement in the initial stages of this thunderous 1809 campaign along the Danube, before then taking a close look at his actions during the massive Battle of Wagram. Finally, we will then analyse these events and discuss the real reason why Bernadotte was removed from his command. Although the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 had brought peace to Europe and all but ensured Napoleon's domination of the mainland, 1808 would see his armies become embroiled in a new war in the Iberian Peninsula. Several disasters, namely the French defeats at Bailén and Vimero, had forced the emperor to enter the fray himself, leading his army into Spain, capturing Madrid, and then chasing Sir John Moore's British force across the mountains towards Corunna. However, before he could complete his conquest, as well as the destruction of the British expeditionary force, events in both Paris and Central Europe would once more require his attention. This is because, despite Napoleon's personal success in the peninsula, news of these French disasters had reached the ears of his opponents, and the air of invincibility that had surrounded his armies since 1805 had been shaken by these events. In Paris, rumours of a coup required his immediate presence to squash, but perhaps more alarmingly, these defeats and whisperings had given encouragement to the Austrian war party, who had been seeking revenge for Ulm and Austerlitz and the humiliation which came with the treaties signed in their aftermath. Therefore, in early 1809, they began to mobilise their armed forces in preparation for a renewed war as negotiations between them and France began to deteriorate. Napoleon, with affairs not yet settled in Spain, hoped for a peaceful solution, but in case negotiations failed, he also began to mobilise the forces he had in Germany, moving them closer to the Danube. With many of his veterans still tied up in Spain, however, this new army of Germany would have to be bolstered by both fresh conscripts as well as foreign troops, including from his allied German states. With peace looking unlikely, and with Napoleon still in Paris, the Austrian army, commanded by the Archduke Charles, decided to seize the initiative, and on the 10th of April 1809 they crossed the frontier into Bavaria, once more tempting fate to cross swords with Napoleon. In relation to these events, Marshal Bernadotte began 1809 as the military governor of the Hanseatic towns in northern Germany, but with the prospect of war looking increasingly likely, he subsequently received orders to travel to Dresden, where he was to organise and take command of the Saxon army. However, these orders actually found the Marshal in bed, for he had been suffering from an attack of spitting up blood, his worst attack since 10 years previous, this one possibly brought about by the news of his mother's death. He challenged these orders on 2 counts: his poor health and his reluctance to accept responsibility for a German contingent after the misunderstandings with the Bavarians which had hampered his movements in the Ulm-Austerlitz campaign 4 years before. Bernadotte had actually asked during the campaigns of 1806 and 1807 not to be saddled with foreign troops, a request to which Napoleon did in fact cater to, but this time his objections were ignored. Therefore, despite his poor health, by the middle of March, Bernadotte left Hamburg and arrived in Dresden, the Saxon capital, 6 days later, an impressive pace for a distance of about 320 miles, but in his haste he had unfortunately arrived before notice of his appointment was given to the Saxon king, and so his arrival was awkward and unexpected. Despite orders confirming the new arrangements arriving only a few days later, this incident, along with the idea of being given a foreign command, already planted a suspicion in Bernadotte's head that someone at imperial headquarters was trying to undermine him, a feeling that would gnaw at his mind throughout the campaign to come. This supposed hidden hand that was working against him, Bernadotte most likely suspected to be Napoleon's chief of staff, Marshal Bernadotte, with whom he had quarrelled ever since their initial meeting in 1797. Although it appeared as if their issues had been resolved after a pleasant meeting during the celebrations of peace at Tilsit 2 years previous, it seems that Bernadotte, barely days into a fresh campaign, was already convinced that his old nemesis was back to his old tricks and trying to stifle any hopes he had of success. Whether Bernadotte was right in this belief we shall discuss in the analysis, but once official confirmation of his appointment arrived, he immediately began to prepare the Saxon army for the potential coming conflict, though his early inspections made clear the strengths and weaknesses of his new command, as the historian Gill identifies. Positive spirit, individual courage, and excellent cavalry were the best features of the Saxon corps in April 1809. On the negative side, however, the contingent suffered from several potentially debilitating fragilities. First, the Saxon army clung to the tactical concepts from the age of Frederick. Stiff and formal, these archaic tactics impeded battlefield maneuverability and made the Saxons slow and cumbersome when compared to their agile and inspired French allies. Second, the Saxons had little experience in combat and were unfamiliar with the organization and employment of large military formations. The third major weakness was perhaps the most serious. Many of Saxony's military deficiencies could have been overcome, or indeed might never have developed, had the army been endowed with capable senior leaders. Unfortunately, most of the men occupying positions of high responsibility in 1809 had attained their ranks by connections, birth, and plodding precise adherence to the details of regulation. In terms of the three arms, their quality was somewhat of a mixed bag, with the infantry being somewhere in the middle. They were organised in a traditional fashion, with the grenadier companies of each battalion detached to form their own grenadier battalions of 4 company strength. The line battalions were then left with 4 companies, and in terms of light troops, each of these companies had 10 Schützen, trained skirmishers who were usually grouped at battalion level under the command of their own officer, giving each battalion essentially just 40 light troops to work with. For comparison, a French infantry battalion at this point had an entire company consisting of 140 voltigeurs who could be utilised in this light infantry role. The historian Nafziger also notes the limitations of the basic Saxon firearm. In early 1809, the old, badly made and inadequate muskets were beginning to be replaced with the new model Neuschule musket. By the outbreak of the 1809 campaign, however, only 2 regiments, König and Neisse Muschel, had been issued the new weapon. It was in cavalry where the Saxons' reputation was at its highest, and in both heavy and light they were highly regarded as some of the finest in Europe. Napoleon had been impressed by them, both when facing them in 1806 and in fighting alongside them the following year, particularly at the Battle of Friedland, where they fought with distinction. However, despite the Saxons, on paper at least, being able to muster 40 squadrons of trained elite cavalry, defeat in 1806 had seen many of their fine horses taken by the French cavalry, meaning that in 1809 the Saxons could only mount half of their troopers, and many of these on young, inexperienced horses. Still, the cavalry was the strong point of the Saxons, and would continue to impress during the campaign to come. If the cavalry was the highlight of the Saxon army, then the artillery was definitely the lowlight, and a lack of attention and peacetime practice meant that they were poorly organised and under-trained. Initially, the Saxons had maintained the practice of regimental guns, but for this campaign they were instead combined into artillery companies. For use in Bernadotte's command, the Saxons were able to form 4 companies, each one consisting of 4 8-pounder guns and 2 8-pounder howitzers. They were split into 2 light and 2 heavy batteries, but this designation was in regards to actual weight of the pieces, as at the opening of the campaign the Saxons had no horse artillery, and even the officers of artillery started without horses. Arguably what made the artillery even worse was the state of its train, as Gill explains. Assembled immediately prior to the conflict from levies provided by the counties of the realm, the trained personnel generally came from the worst elements of society, including vagabonds and released felons, men who often had no conception of horses or harnesses. The lone peacetime team was so undermanned that it could only deploy 1 gun at a time during the artillery's annual firing, and there was no time to prepare it or the newly mobilized teams to meet the demands of modern warfare. The fundamentals of their duties and familiarity with their batteries had to be acquired on the march, resulting in artillery that showed itself slow and inept on the battlefield. Whatever its flaws, this small force of just over 19,000 men was rebranded as the 9th Corps of the Army of Germany and organized into 2 divisions, each consisting of 2 infantry brigades and 1 cavalry brigade. The 4 artillery companies were kept in the reserve park, along with 2 additional guns and a small pontoon company. After conducting his first inspection and putting the Saxon troops through several manoeuvres, here is what Bernadotte wrote to Napoleon regarding their quality. I have the honour to inform your majesty that I have reviewed the Saxon troops. I have sent the Major General the strength of their force and their location. I had them brought together and had them execute the principal combat manoeuvres. I was very satisfied with instruction which I had not expected. The cavalry above all is well trained and has as much cohesion as the young horses of which it is almost entirely composed will permit. There is a large number of recruits in the infantry, but the commanders and officers evidence much goodwill. Nonetheless, I continue to think that this body of troops, acting alone, will not be as useful to your majesty as they would if distributed by division within the French corps d'armée, because affairs here are characterized by great dilatoriness. The artillery is poorly organized, the train above all is very defective. The idea of combining the Saxons into French corps was actually the practice that Napoleon had implemented during the 1807 campaign in Poland, when Saxon troops first fought alongside the French. For example, at the Battle of Friedland, the 3rd Division of Lands Command was entirely Saxon, whilst 3 regiments of Saxon cavalry were attached to Victor's 1st Corps. Therefore, the idea of the Saxons being an independent force had not been tried, and was something which Bernadotte was keen to avoid. The Saxon troops will not be able to render your majesty any service if they are not combined with a French force superior to their own. I believe the only way to take advantage of them is to incorporate them by brigade into some French divisions. These misgivings were again ignored, and on the 14th of April, 4 days after the Austrian main army had crossed the Bavarian border and opened hostilities, Bernadotte received orders to march his 9th Corps out of Dresden and towards the main army. However, rather than simply marching south and into Bavaria, he was tasked with taking a longer route towards Westphalia, for it seems that Napoleon feared a possible uprising in this region. 9th Corps subsequently departed Dresden on the 15th and 16th of April, arriving at Weimar on the 23rd, where fresh orders met them. With the fear of insurrection now subsided, they were ordered to march immediately south in order to join the main army. During this march, Bernadotte continued to write to Napoleon, complaining about the quality, or more precisely the lack of it, within his force, stating that they were slow in marching, and stressing still the necessity to reinforce them with French troops. On the 28th, when he arrived at Schliess, he received confirmation that General Pierre-Louis Dupat's French division, consisting of the 5th Leger and 19th Line, and 12 guns, would be attached to his 9th Corps. Although this pleased Bernadotte, he still continued to bombard imperial headquarters with further complaints, on the 30th of April writing to Berthier, "The Saxon army has no light artillery whatsoever, and its foot artillery is extremely poor. I may point out to your highness that the Dutch division in Hamburg has 2 perfectly organized light artillery companies. One of these could be put at the disposition of the army of Germany." It was on this day that the Saxons saw their first taste of combat in the campaign, with their advance guard clashing with a small patrol of Austrian Uhlans near the town of Eger. Although initially taken by surprise and in flank, after rallying, the Saxon cavalry managed to reverse the situation and free those who had initially been captured, and thus could claim to have had the better of the overall engagement. A similar clash of patrols took place at Asch around the same time. Although each side lost only about a dozen men in these minor encounters, they brought home to officers and men alike the reality of combat and had two important results for Ninth Corps. First, its subsequent marches were conducted with columns ready for action and patrols placed to the front and flanks for security. Second, the attitude of the men began to change. The army's relative friendly perception of their old Austrian comrades in arms gradually losing place to a more combative spirit. These small-scale skirmishes continued as Ninth Corps marched on, and at Bernadotte's insistence, the Saxon cavalry probed further and further into Bohemia, their reconnaissance allowing them to conclude that the border was only weakly held by a very stretched Austrian force. Therefore, in order to give his troops some experience, he prepared to launch a small-scale raid on the 7th or 8th of May, but before he could carry it out, new orders directed his troops to Passau on the Danube. Ninth Corps, having split into two elements to undertake this march, were once more united on the 12th of May in Passau, where Bernadotte was relieved to find Dupaz's French division waiting for him, though the Marshal was still not satisfied and once again wrote to Napoleon, this time asking that this French contingent be reinforced by another infantry regiment as well as some cavalry. Whilst Ninth Corps had been marching and its commander issuing a series of complaints, Napoleon, although initially caught off guard by the Austrian advance, had rallied his forces and via a series of manoeuvres around Landshut had turned the tide and forced Charles out of Bavaria and across the Danube, leaving a now undefended Vienna at the mercy of the French. Although Napoleon quickly occupied the Austrian capital, entering on the same day that Bernadotte arrived in Passau, it did little to dent the will or determination of the Austrian forces, who, having destroyed the Danube bridges around Vienna, were now freely operating on the left bank of the river. It was for this reason that Bernadotte, after giving his troops a day's rest, was ordered to march to Linz in order to secure the bridge there, as well as Napoleon's left flank, whilst the Emperor figured out a way of crossing the Danube and forcing the Austrians to battle. En route to Linz, however, Bernadotte was met with several more messages from Imperial headquarters, ordering him to halt his march and to await further instructions. The reason for this was that the Tyrol region had seen an insurrection, which Marshal Lefebvre's Bavarian Corps was attempting to suppress. Therefore, Bernadotte was ordered to wait, and if required, to march and offer support to the Bavarians, but this proved unnecessary, and on the 16th he was ordered to continue his march east. Also on the 16th, there arrived several messages from General Van Damme, a friend of Bernadotte's, and whose corps of Württembergers were already at Linz, fearing that he was about to be attacked by a strong Austrian force. Bernadotte therefore set his Saxons on the road, and his cavalry arrived at Linz early on the 17th, whilst elements of his infantry began to arrive by mid-afternoon. They were given little time to rest as the Austrian attack began about 2 p.m, though it proved to be poorly orchestrated and the Württembergers were adequate for the task, and once able to go on the offensive themselves, they were supported by elements of the Saxon cavalry. The battle appeared to be over when a second Austrian column, which was supposed to have coordinated its advance with the first, finally arrived. Now being late, however, the Austrians declined an attack upon the bridge at Linz and instead moved to ease the pressure on the beaten first column. It was the Saxon guns that first challenged them, but they were relatively ineffective and were soon overawed by their Austrian counterparts. Bernadotte then personally led forward some of the infantry, but they failed to make any headway up the heavily wooded slopes and were easily repulsed until the coming of night ended proceedings. The reason for the infantry's struggle was simply because the men lacked proper light infantry training, and those members who did possess some, the Schützen, were detached at battalion level, as was standard practice, and so not available when Bernadotte shouted, "Allons, tirailleurs!" Due to these struggles, Bernadotte decided to consolidate all of the Schützen into 2 separate battalions of their own, attaching 1 to each brigade, and placed under the command of the better of the Saxon officers. Although this would now give him 2 dependable and reasonably sized units of light troops for future encounters, the move also deprived the line battalions of their best skirmishers, and although these line troops felt that they benefited and learnt a good deal from their evenings spent skirmishing in the trees near Linz, as Gill explains, it was nowhere near adequate. This first serious combat for the Saxon infantry illustrated the limitations of its training and organisation. 2 or 3 hours on a dusky hillside do not make true skirmishers, however, and the Saxons would suffer from their antiquated tactical forms through the remainder of the campaign, particularly when they were faced with the frightening speed and violence of a major Napoleonic battle at Wagram. After the Battle of Linz, Bernadotte and Van Damme were prepared to receive another Austrian attack, but as it never came, they instead sent strong fighting patrols across the river, clashing with the Austrians to mixed success. With Napoleon planning on crossing the Danube and taking the fight to the Austrians, Bernadotte was ordered to push north into Bohemia with his 9th Corps, ideally drawing attention and troops away from Napoleon's planned attack site. The Marshal, however, was adamant that such an endeavour was foolhardy given the troops at his disposal. In writing to Marshal Berthier, he noted, "To debouch from here with any hope of success, a force much more numerous than mine is required, and above all, more experienced troops and generals familiar with the command of independent columns. The Saxons, I repeat, are incapable of acting independently, and there is not one of their generals whom I could trust with a detached operation. If I had 8,000 or 10,000 French troops, I could attempt something, without guarantee of any great success, but, I repeat, with the Saxons I can do nothing." On the same day that Bernadotte composed this letter, the 21st of May, Napoleon attempted to cross the Danube and force the Archduke Charles to battle. Unfortunately for the French, the attempt was poorly conceived and badly executed, for although an initial landing saw the occupation of the villages of Aspern and Essling, and thus secured a potential bridgehead for the further development of his forces, the bridge to the island of Lebeau was repeatedly damaged by the sending of various debris down the river by the Austrians. Unable to bring across enough men to reinforce and expand his bridgehead, Napoleon was forced to withdraw and retreat back to the island of Lebeau, and accept that, for the first time since becoming emperor, he had been soundly beaten. With this failure, Bernadotte's proposed push into Bohemia was thus cancelled, and at the end of May, 9th Corps was ordered to move closer to Vienna, for Napoleon was determined to stage a second crossing of the Danube, but this time it would be better planned and involved many more men. Just prior to undertaking this march, and in an attempt to improve the mobility on the battlefield of his corps, Bernadotte sought to establish a horse artillery battery. However, lacking the required quality in terms of men, horses and equipment, it proved to be ineffective. The result was a small battery whose performance remained far behind expectations, and which, encumbered by horses the men hardly knew how to handle, could not be employed other than as a foot battery. The march to Vienna again saw the Saxons engage in further skirmishes, with one in particular, Amstetten, proving troublesome. Thanks to negligence on the part of one Saxon major in failing to place adequate sentries or outposts, his detachment was ambushed by Austrians whilst in their beds, and the confusing nighttime melee that followed cost the Saxons not only 62 casualties, but a good deal of their pride and confidence. By the 10th of June, 9th Corps had fully arrived at St. Polten, which was to be their place of residence as well as a chance for further training until called forward for the main crossing which Napoleon was still in the process of planning. Given the pause in hostilities, Napoleon was also able to address a few of Bernadotte's issues and allowed the Marshal to fully reorganize his corps. Firstly, the 2nd Battalion of each infantry regiment was amalgamated into the 1st Battalion in order to create a much stronger unit, whilst the excess officers, usually the oldest and least able, were sent marching back to Dresden. Secondly, the Schützen battalions were further reinforced with additional men from the line, bringing the strength of each to more than 700 men, split into 4 companies. The line battalions, lacking any light troops, were also authorised to create new 40-man shoots and detachments, who were to be trained in light infantry work, though of course a month's training before the Battle of Wagram would not be enough to actually turn them into capable elite skirmishers. Finally, the order of battle for the corps was altered, with the grenadier battalions, previously split across the two divisions, now combined into the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division, creating, with the addition of the 1st Schutzen Battalion, a very elite and capable force. The other Schutzen Battalion was attached to 2nd Division. The cavalry, having performed well during the campaign so far, was kept in its original organisation, but the artillery was now attached permanently to the infantry divisions, with each infantry brigade receiving one of the foot batteries. The supposed horse battery was retained in reserve along with the park and the small pontoon detachment. Perhaps the real reason that Napoleon authorised these changes was because, for the first time in the campaign, Bernadotte was able to address his issues in person to the emperor, for upon his corps' arrival in St. Pölten, the marshal was summoned to imperial headquarters, where he stayed at Napoleon's temporary residence at the Schönbrunn Palace just outside Vienna. Bernadotte arrived at Schönbrunn on Tuesday the 6th of June, expecting to spend only one night at the palace. He remained there until the following Sunday. Each morning, as he was preparing to return to St. Pölten, Napoleon urged him to stay longer, and Bernadotte willingly obliged his emperor. Napoleon was in the best of tempers. When Bernadotte returned to St. Pölten, he was pleased with his reception. Napoleon had brushed aside his objections to commanding the Saxons. Bernadotte might not speak German, but he could always show by encouraging gestures what should be done, and there was no need to augment Ninth Corps with French regiments, for the Emperor was sure that his marshal's own renown was in itself enough to lift the fighting ardour of the troops to the highest level. The fulsome phrases rang with welcome conviction in Gascon ears. With Bernadotte certainly flattered and encouraged by Napoleon's words, and with his troops now better organised and undergoing some much-needed training, Ninth Corps was as ready as it was ever going to be for the battle to come, and as June passed into July, Napoleon's incessant planning was finally about to be put to the test. After the disaster at Aspern-Essling, Napoleon had spared no amount of energy in assuring that his second crossing would be much more successful. In contrast with his precipitate actions at Aspern-Essling, the next battle was minutely prepared by Napoleon, with the river crossing designed almost like an attack against a fortress. His first task was to fortify the island of Lobau, which would once again act as the jumping-off point for the crossing, but this time both the island as well as the bridges which joined it to the southern bank would be much more secure. He transformed Lobau Island into a vast encampment crisscrossed with orderly roads and equipped with powder magazines, bakeries, food stores and a hospital. Workshops of every description sprang up to craft the numerous bridges and boats he would need to carry the army across the Stadler Arm. With the bridge building entrusted to General Bertrand, Napoleon oversaw the installation of multiple batteries, which housed a total of 109 guns on the island, many of which were of siege caliber and were designed to act as both a defensive measure as well as enable a strong preliminary bombardment to proceed and assist the crossing. As Gill mentions in that previous quote, the island itself was also turned into a massive supply depot for the army, with all of its stores and magazines set up in preparation for the assault. Finally, because the destruction of the bridges had denied him much needed reinforcements during the Battle of Aspern-Essling, this time Napoleon intended for most of his army to already be on the island of Lobau prior to his attack. To ensure as much surprise as possible, the different corps were to cross to the island during the nights preceding the planned assault. Therefore, Bernadotte's 9th Corps was ordered to leave St. Pölten, and after arriving at Kaiser Ebersdorf on the 3rd of July, they were to cross onto the island during the night of the 3rd-4th. Unfortunately, it seems the delay meant that parts of 9th Corps were still crossing come dawn, and was subsequently observed by the Austrians, but we will talk about this more in the analysis section later. However, as planned, by the evening of the 4th of July, the army was in position and ready for the main crossing. Unlike on the previous attempt, when Napoleon had crossed towards Aspern-Essling, the crossing this time was to be on a much broader front and from the east side of the island. To confuse the Austrians, however, on the 30th of June, Legrand's division had crossed in the original location, pushed out the enemy outposts, and erected a battery, as well as 2 bridges to ideally make Charles think that Napoleon would attempt the same crossing as last time. The Emperor was also worried that his prey might still escape him, or even attempt to cross themselves elsewhere on the Danube. Therefore, this preliminary crossing was also hoped to pin the Austrians in position. The main crossing was destined to take place during the night of the 4th-5th of July, but a massive thunderstorm erupted and threatened to derail Napoleon's plans. But, despite several officers calling for a delay, the Emperor insisted on continuing, and illuminated by lightning and accompanied by a symphony of thunder and siege artillery, the assault began around 9 p.m. To understand this new attempt across the Danube and Bernadotte's place within it, it is worth explaining Napoleon's plan for the assault and deployment of the army. As a small aside, for those who have seen my video on logistics, you may remember the following quote from Jomini, who criticised the plans for this crossing and believed that they contained a glaring but at the time unrecognised error. The Chief of Staff, although he made 10 copies of the famous decree, did not observe that by mistake the bridge of the centre had been assigned to Davout, who had the right wing, whilst the bridge on the right was assigned to Oudinot, who was in the centre. These 2 corps passed each other in the night, and, had it not been for the good sense of the men and their officers, a dreadful scene of confusion might have been the result. The error doubtless originated with Napoleon while dictating his decree, but should it not have been detected by a Chief of Staff who made 10 copies of the order and whose duty it was to supervise the formation of the troops? Although Jomini was attached to imperial headquarters during this period, the historian Gill, whose work on this campaign is fantastic, believes that these orders were deliberate and makes no reference to any mistakes within them, and when you look with the help of a map at what Napoleon envisioned for the crossing, I think that I agree with Gill. The first crossing was to be undertaken by Oudinot's 2nd Corps on the right. Their task was to clear the Hansel-Grund and thus secure what would become the rear area for the army. Once these men had landed, the next across were to be Massena's 4th Corps, closely followed by Davout's 3rd. These 2 corps were to swing to the left upon crossing and push generally northward, but with Massena leaning to secure the army's left flank, whilst Davout leant right to secure the opposite flank. Then, once Oudinot had cleared the southern sector, he was to take his corps north and fill the gap which would have grown between Davout and Massena, and become the centre of this first line of the army. Therefore, if everything went to plan, then by the time that Oudinot had completed his first mission, Davout's corps would have ideally already crossed far enough to the right, and would therefore be out of the way for 2nd Corps to then pass behind them and take up position in the centre. It would seem that Napoleon wanted both Massena and Davout to be the wings for his army, most likely because not only were these 2 his strongest corps, but these 2 commanders were undoubtedly the best currently available with the army, and therefore could be trusted to act without direct supervision. Their conduct over the following 2 days would certainly justify the faith Napoleon placed in them, as well as their positions within the formation of battle. However, it could be argued, and this is seemingly what Jomini did, that if Napoleon desired Davout to be on the right, then why did he not take up Oudinot's role and cross first, clear the Hansel-Grund, and then simply march northeast and take up his position on the flank? The problem with this plan is that if Davout ran into any issues when clearing the south, then the right flank of the army, whilst marching north, would be vulnerable and much weakened until Davout could get into position. Whereas with Napoleon's plan, by entrusting the initial mission in the south to Oudinot, if anything did go wrong, then Davout would still be able to secure the right flank of the army, and the gap in the centre could easily be filled by either Bernadotte's 9th Corps or Eugene's Army of Italy, which were to cross slightly later and make up the second line. Jomini is correct though that during the night troops from 2nd and 3rd Corps did cross paths, but this was ironically because Oudinot completed his task faster than anticipated, whilst Davout, through no real fault of his own and probably as a result of the weather, was slightly delayed. However, the professionalism of the officers ensured that the mix-up was sorted with as little confusion as possible, and by morning both corps were in their correct positions. Therefore, if anything, rather than showing the faults in the French system, this entire operation is a testament to the logistical capabilities and professionalism of the French army at this point. Despite a tremendous thunderstorm doing its best to impede operations, and despite the crossing taking place during the night, by mid-afternoon on the 5th, Napoleon had essentially managed to get the bulk of the army across to the northern bank and in a secure position ready to fight. At the very least, the Austrians were certainly caught out by the speed and size of this crossing, for Charles and his staff failed to react to the initial reports of the French crossings, believing that, like at Aspern and Essling, they would have ample time to figure out if this was just another ruse or a real attack, and if it was the latter, then bring up their forces to obstruct and constrict the French crossing. Instead, when Charles and his staff arrived on the high ground beyond the Russbach around midday, they were seemingly astounded by the sheer number of men that the French had managed to get across, and who were now preparing to march across the plain, referred to as the Marchfeld, towards them. Many factors hampered the Austrian commanders as they tried to respond to the French assault. Chief among them were the obscurity of night and storm, the unanticipated speed of the crossing and the bridging operations, and the ferocious cannonade. Moreover, most Austrians seemed to have concluded that the French would not attempt a crossing under such miserable weather, and many of the first Jaegers pickets seemed to have been more interested in seeking shelter than watching the Stadler arm. Returning to Bernadotte, although his 9th Corps was scheduled to cross at around 9 AM, delays meant that they didn't begin until 10:30, and were not fully across until the early afternoon. They then took up their position on the left of the second line of the French army, slightly behind the right and centre of Marshal Massena's 4th Corps. Bernadotte, however, was already frustrated because elements of his, in his eyes already understrength corps, had been taken from him, as 2 of his grenadier battalions had been left on Le Beau Island as a precaution to reinforce the garrison there, and wouldn't be released until the afternoon. Worse, and without Bernadotte's permission or knowledge, someone from Imperial headquarters, potentially Napoleon or Berthier, authorised for the Prince Johann Chevaulegers to be detached from his command in order to cover the deployment of the artillery of Oudinot's corps as it took position in the centre. Bernadotte may have been getting aggravated, but with the army formed in 2 lines, Napoleon now felt comfortable to press forward and expand his position, and he subsequently issued directions of advance for his corps. On the right, Davout's 3rd Corps was instructed to move on Glinzendorf, with his attached cavalry probing to the northeast to cover the flank and watch for a potential approach from the Austrian forces commanded by the Archduke John, Charles's brother. Oudinot's 2nd Corps was to keep alongside Davout and head towards Grosshofen, but on the left, Massena was ordered to pivot and head west, keeping the Danube on his flank, and to capture Aspern and Essling while heading towards Breton-Lee and Herschatten. As you can see, these movements, particularly the one by 4th Corps, create a gap in the centre of the French line, into which Napoleon placed first Bernadotte's 9th Corps and secondly Eugene's army of Italy. This manoeuvre, however, was not quite so straightforward for Bernadotte, who once more saw his command being depleted. In the first instance, as the corps in the front line began to diverge, General Dupat's French division, along with a battalion of Saxon grenadiers and a battalion of Schutzen, were ordered forward towards Rasdorf in order to fill the gap. Once he had secured this village, Dupat was then instructed to move closer to Oudinot in order to protect his flank, and thus he was essentially detached at this point from Bernadotte's command. The situation was not to improve for Bernadotte when he was finally ordered to push his corps into the front line and head for the village of Adaclar. Although already having lost several strong elements of his command, he was instructed to first leave his entire 1st Division as well as an artillery battery in Enzersdorf so as to protect the bridgehead. This was only a temporary measure, but it rankled and compounded the de facto detachment of Dupat, leaving the Marshal with only his advance guard and General Georges von Pollen's 2nd Division to conduct his advance in the centre. Delays in getting all of the Saxon artillery across the Stadler arm meant that his force consisted of a mere 6 battalions, 16 squadrons and 8 guns as it made its way across the wheat fields south of Rasdorf. Although at this point the French advance had met with very little resistance, elements of the Austrian reserve cavalry were in position to challenge any move towards Adaclar, but fortunately for Bernadotte, his fine Saxon cavalry were more than equal to the task at hand. After spotting an Austrian heavy cavalry brigade, the cavalry of the advance guard was sent forward to clear them out of 9th Corps' path, but foolishly the Prince Clemens Chevaulegers, instead of waiting for support, decided to attack on their own. The Austrian cavalry chose to receive this charge at the halt, and with a carbine volley, causing the Saxon horses to shy and stutter at the last minute, and the regiment was forced to retreat in some disorder. Thankfully, Bernadotte had called up the rest of his cavalry, and moving through the intervals of their retreating comrades, they formed in echelon and prepared to attack. Moving forward at the trot, the Saxon cavalry advanced, though as they did, the Hussar regiment on the right of the line suddenly came under fire from a previously unseen Austrian infantry battalion. As coolly as if on parade, the first squadron of the Hussars pivoted to their right and charged at the offending infantry who, caught in the act of reloading and surprised by the sudden manoeuvre, were forced to flee, resulting in many casualties and prisoners, as well as the capture of a standard. Meanwhile, the rest of the Saxon cavalry was approaching the Austrian cuirassiers, who again attempted to receive this charge at the halt, and with a volley of carbines from the second rank. This time, however, the volley proved ineffective, and the Saxons crashed into their ranks, and with the remaining two squadrons of the Hussar regiment wrapping around the left flank, the melee was one-sided, and the Austrians were forced to retire at the cost of 85 prisoners and numerous dead. Their destruction may have been complete had they not been saved by another Austrian cavalry brigade, who threatened the Saxons into falling back to their own lines. As the sweating but triumphant troopers rode back to reform north of Rasdorf, they were met by a happy Bernadotte, who called out to the officers of the Liebe cuirassiers, "I have always counted on you, but today you have exceeded my expectations." He had good cause to be satisfied. The Saxon cavalry charges had effectively cleared the entire field between Rasdorf and Adderklar, and allowed the infantry of 9th Corps to advance towards the latter village. Advancing unopposed, the Saxons cleared and captured Adderklar, and by 7 p.m. they were in position north and east of the village, with the Saxon cavalry protecting their left flank. Although it was assumed that the fighting was complete for the day, General Savary, aide to Napoleon, rode to Bernadotte and instructed him to launch an attack on Wagram. This attack was not an isolated one, and was one element of a multi-part assault upon the plateau north of the Russbach stream. Sources and historians vary as to the purpose of this attack so late in the evening, but Gill tends to regard it as a form of reconnaissance. Napoleon was uncertain as evening fell. He was determined to destroy Charles's army as rapidly as possible, but the weak resistance during his march across the Marchfeld and the gradual evaporation of gunfire as night came on suggested that the force to his front might be nothing more than a strong rear guard. Personal observation disclosed little, as the trees along the Russbach and the steep escarpment hid the strength of the enemy on the plateau. To clarify the situation, he thus decided to conduct a large-scale reconnaissance in force against the Russbach position. If the Austrians were planning a withdrawal, this might lock them in place. If they were planning to stand, he would gain an appreciation of the enemy's strength, dispositions, and morale. This attack was to take place as 4 supposedly simultaneous thrusts, but their lack of coordination would see the French ultimately fail. The evening attack on the Russbach heights can be considered as 4 different thrusts, related to one another and partly overlapping in execution, but uncoordinated and separated by time. Oudinot, Dupas-Eugene, Davout, and Bernadotte. Though crippled in their potential by debilitating flaws, the surprising aspect of these disjointed operations is that they came very close to dramatic success at several points. Being closest to Napoleon's headquarters, Oudinot received his orders first, and consequently at about 7:30 p.m. was the first to launch his attack on Baumersdorf, and although he initially captured the village, a series of Austrian counterattacks sent the French tumbling back down the slope in the growing darkness. Not long after Oudinot's first units had gone into action, a thrust between Baumersdorf and Wagram was undertaken by a combination of Dupas's command, consisting of his French division, as well as the units of Saxon grenadiers and Schutzen still attached to him, alongside elements of Eugene's Army of Italy. This attack was to be supported by the 24 guns of the Imperial Guard horse artillery, who rode forward and unlimbered near to Eugene and Dupas's batteries, and together they unleashed a brief but heavy bombardment of the Austrian position. At about 8 p.m, Dupaz's division began to cross the Russbach and ascend the slope, but frustratingly for the commander, his cavalry and artillery struggled to find a place to cross, and Eugene's troops following behind encountered the same difficulties, meaning that the infantry was attacking alone. Fortune hadn't completely abandoned the French at this point, however, for their attack had managed to find the gap between the 1st and 2nd Austrian corps, and the lay of the ground offered to shield part of their approach from Austrian eyes. Therefore, the Austrians were caught unprepared for such a late-in-the-day attack, and with the confusion of it taking place between two different commands, the Austrian units began to give way, and the French gained a solid foothold on the heights. Dupaz and MacDonald, who was leading Lamarck's division, called for reinforcements to help fortify their gains, and although only infantry were able to cross the stream, perhaps 2 more divisions might have proved adequate, for the centre of the Austrian position on the Russbach heights was on the verge of being broken. Recognizing that his entire position was therefore under threat, Charles himself rode to the scene of the crisis, and along with several senior Austrian commanders, managed to rally and reform the Austrian soldiers, and they soon began to organize several counterattacks. Although the situation was certainly steadied by Austrian superior numbers, the gradual French reinforcements were helping them to hold on to a foothold upon the heights, though disaster was about to strike. The Saxons attached to Dupaz's command were holding in the centre, and unfortunately, in a combination of the growing darkness and thickening smoke, Serraz's French division coming up to support them mistook their white uniforms for Austrian and subsequently opened fire upon them. Being fired upon from both front and back, the Saxons understandably began to retreat in confusion, but even this manoeuvre was perceived by Serraz's men to be an Austrian attack, from which they too promptly fled back down the slope. Although the French attack didn't completely crumble during this incident, such a blow to the centre of their line did make their position untenable, and the Austrian counterattacks and superiority of numbers, especially in cavalry and artillery, eventually made the difference, and the French were pushed off the ridge and back across the Russbach to their starting positions. Whilst this attack was taking place, Davout on the right of the line went forward with his own corps, though his effort was much less committal than the others. His orders were to storm the village of Markgrafschneuside as well as the heights beyond it, but Davout seems to have been unconvinced by the enterprise from the very start, and after failing to convince the imperial officer sent to him that such an attack was not going to shift the Austrians from the position, he instead sought to prove his point via a show of force. He therefore moved 40 guns, supported by a strong skirmish line, forward to bombard the village of Markgrafschneuside, while 2 of his divisions crossed the Russbach and made to threaten to outflank the Austrian position. As the Marshal had predicted, however, none of these moves affected the determination of the Austrians, who, in Davout's own words, only appeared more emboldened by the French threat. The Marshal, satisfied that he had carried out his orders and tested the Austrian position, withdrew his force by 10 p.m. and instead had them rest in preparation for the inevitable trials of the following day. The final events of the evening took place on the opposite end of the Russbach heights and involved Marshal Bernadotte and his 9th Corps. Although he received his orders to attack the village of Wagram at around 7:30 p.m, Bernadotte was adamant that doing so with his depleted command would court disaster. Therefore, he chose to wait for his 1st Division to move up from Enzersdorf, as well as for his cavalry to move into a position that would shield the left of his advance. Although the cavalry was in position by 8 p.m, the 1st Division did not arrive until 9 p.m, at which point Bernadotte finally began his assault. Unfortunately, although he had delayed his attack, the Marshal neglected to undertake any further reconnaissance, nor use the time to bombard the enemy with his admittedly limited number of guns. Instead, he impatiently waited for his troops to arrive before immediately launching his infantry into a head-on attack at Wagram. Schutzen in front, the Saxon soldiers went forward with vigour, but lost their tactical formation as they splashed through the muddy Russbach and encountered the walls and gardens on the edge of the village. Despite their inexperience with loose order formations, von Lecoq's infantry brigade managed to get into the southwestern part of the village, though several attempts to storm the market square were repulsed with heavy casualties. Bernadotte therefore ordered forward von Seschau's infantry brigade in support, but despite a valiant effort, these men were able to make no more gains in the village, and the 2 brigades quickly became mixed up, though they doggedly defended the small portion of buildings that they held onto. Bernadotte was determined to see some success, and spotting von Hartich's crack brigade of grenadiers and Schutzen approaching, he dispatched one of his aides to order them to storm the village. Galloping over to the grenadiers, one of the marshal's adjutants brought Hartich the order to storm the burning village, but neglected to tell the Saxon general that his countrymen were already fighting in the blazing streets ahead. The consequences of this order, the darkness and the general confusion were tragic. The grenadiers quickly crossed the brook, and upon reforming began to march towards Wagram, with muskets loaded and lowered and bayonets thrust forward. As they neared the village, they could see shapes in the inferno ahead, and several groups of men came stumbling towards them. These were wounded comrades falling back after the first attacks, but in the darkness the grenadiers confused their white coats for Austrian and immediately opened fire from the hip before halting to reload and fire again. Their mistake quickly became apparent, but ceasing the fire took the officers several minutes, and by which point the damage had already been done. Receiving musket fire from their rear, the Saxons in the streets and houses believed themselves outflanked and fled from the village, crashing into Hartich's men in their efforts to escape. A simultaneous counterattack by 2 Habsburg battalions cleared out the remaining Saxons, and by 11 p.m. Wagram was firmly in Austrian hands. This final act put an end to the night's proceedings, and 9th Corps was forced to fall back towards Adderklaar in order to lick their wounds. They had suffered heavy casualties in their frontal attacks upon Wagram, including 2 of the brigade commanders, Lecoq and Hartich, whilst the first 2 infantry brigades had each suffered at least 30% casualties. It was not good tidings for an already weakened force. We will assess this attack in more detail during the analysis, but for now it is important to understand that Bernadotte blamed both Napoleon and Imperial headquarters for his costly failure to capture Wagram. He felt that Berthier had been purposely removing troops from his command all day, and prior to the attack it was Berthier that denied him any other reinforcements. As for Napoleon, Bernadotte felt that his emperor was blind not to see the importance of Wagram, and in a rant to General Dumas, who had come from Imperial headquarters, he raged that he should have been sent 20,000 extra men to take the position, before concluding that had he, Bernadotte, been in charge of the army, then he would have been able to compel the Archduke Charles to lay down his arms almost without a blow, by executing a scientific manoeuvre. These words quickly reached the ears of a less than impressed Napoleon, but with the next day promising even more bloodshed, he let the matter slide, and instead focused on preparations for the morrow. Despite the evening attack on the Russbach Heights having seen the French return to their starting positions, the 5th of July had undoubtedly been a success for Napoleon, having passed 150,000 men over the Danube, and unlike at Aspern-Essling, he had this time gained adequate deployment room, leaving him with plenty of options for the following day. Napoleon, as was his custom, did not fix upon a definitive plan of operations. Relying on the competence of his subordinates, the agility of his army, and the incisive dexterity of his own thinking, he drew his forces closer together to await whatever opportunities might come with the dawn. As Gill states, Napoleon during the night issued orders for his army to close in on itself, particularly the flanking corps of Davout and Massena, though the latter was ordered to leave Boudet's division to hold Aspern and Essling, and thus protect the army's connection with the Danube and the island of Lebeau. On the opposite side of the Russbach, Charles and his commanders were a little less sure of themselves, though their successful defence of the heights had gone some way to boosting morale. The general success and speed of the French's crossing had certainly taken the Habsburg command by surprise, however, and Napoleon's positioning had essentially forced Charles's army to be split into 2 wings, pivoted on Wagram at a right angle. Although the French army was also at the same angle, they were on the shorter side, and thus had the advantage of a central position, which offered shorter movements and in theory easier coordination between the various elements of the army. Given what was before him, Charles therefore felt that he had only one realistic option available to him. As it was no longer feasible to unite the army on the heights, Charles saw a surprise attack as the only conclusion that could avail a weaker party against a strong in a completely open terrain, something his key staff officers seemed to have preferred all along. Charles correctly realised that a strong French attack around the pivot of his army could easily see his command sundered in 2, and so he sought to preempt this possibility with a strong attack of his own. There is a little debate between the historians as to the complete outlook and intention of this attack, but generally it was to take place as follows. 3rd and 6th Corps were to move southeast, with 6th Corps putting its right flank on the Danube and pushing towards Asper and Essling, whilst 3rd Corps was to support this manoeuvre via Lepolo and Brienne-Lee. Thus together they would drive in the French left flank. Meanwhile, 1st Corps was to act as the pivot for this move, keeping part of its force on the heights around Wagram, while swinging the remainder south in order to take Adder-Clar and join up with the right wing. 2nd Corps was to hold on to its position on the heights as stubbornly as possible and only push over the Russbach once there was adequate room for deployment, as made possible by a combination of 4th Corps and the supposed arrival of the Archduke John. However, the role for this left flank is where the historians tend to disagree, as Gill explains. Rosenberg's role is one of the lingering controversies regarding this attack plan. Did Charles imagine a double envelopment? Was 4th Corps only to provide a diversionary feint? There is no clear answer, but it seems most likely that the army leadership, counting on Johann's arrival, saw Rosenberg as a secondary attack that would stress the French line and perhaps preempt the threat to their own left. As Gill alludes to here, the Austrian High Command were expecting that the Archduke John, Charles's brother and in control of a separate but much smaller force, would be arriving at some point in the day from the east, and would therefore theoretically threaten the French's right flank, as well as link up with the 4th Corps. Having come to a decision at around midnight, the orders were written out and distributed to the various corps, who began to move out before dawn. Not long after starting, it became apparent to the leading elements of 1st Corps that they had been given an unexpected but extremely welcome gift during the night. Bernadotte, who had been absent from Napoleon's own planning meeting as he was still attempting to rally elements of his Saxon Corps, had taken it upon himself to abandon the village of Adder-Clar after receiving orders to move closer to Eugene's army of Italy on his right, whilst Massena was to move up on his left. Fearing that his position was becoming stretched, he therefore moved his troops backwards so as to shorten his line, but unfortunately he failed to inform either Imperial headquarters or even Massena of this movement. The Austrian scouts, upon arriving at the village in the early hours of the morning, gleefully sent back reports that it was unoccupied, and the Austrian commanders lost no time in occupying what had been an important early objective for them. Although Adder-Clar was quickly secured, as a whole the Austrian offensive suffered from the same problems as the French's the previous evening, in that due to delays in receiving orders, it was to become a series of unconnected and ill-coordinated thrusts. The 1st Corps to advance happened to be the 4th on the left, which set off at 4 AM, and within an hour had pushed the French skirmishers back from the Russbach and had one column advancing towards Grosshofen and another towards Gliesendorf. The sound of this conflict disturbed Napoleon, who, in fearing that an attack on this flank by the Austrians must surely mean that the Archduke John had arrived, quickly ordered his guard and 2 divisions of heavy cavalry to move to the right, whilst he rode ahead to assess the situation for himself. By the time that he had arrived, however, the Austrians were already beginning to fall back across the Russbach. The reasons for this were twofold. In the first place, although they had gained a foothold in Grosshofen, elsewhere this attack was beginning to stall, simply because, although an Austrian offensive was unexpected, Davout's men were already awake and preparing for their own advance, and were therefore able to quickly respond to the threat. Secondly, Charles himself had issued an order to call off the attack in this sector, because he feared that the 4th Corps might become isolated. The original idea was for this offensive to be timed with that on the opposite flank, as well as ideally taking place once John was in sight of the battlefield, but thanks to delays, none of the other corps nor John were yet in position, and so 4th Corps was ordered back across the Russbach, and to set up and maintain a strong defence of Markgrafenhüschiedl. By 6 AM they were back in their original positions. Therefore, once Napoleon was able to ascertain that the situation was under control, and that there was as yet no sign of John, he ordered his guard back to the centre, though spotting an opportunity, he did order the horse artillery from the 2 heavy cavalry divisions to gallop forward and place themselves on the flank of the retreating Austrians, and inflict as much devastation as they could. With the Austrians back upon the heights, Napoleon commanded Davout to attack immediately, but the Marshal instead convinced his emperor to allow him to delay this attack by 2 hours, during which time he would restock his ammunition and manoeuvre across the Rustbach before commencing a decisive assault which would then roll up the enemy's left. Napoleon agreed, and leaving him with one of the heavy cavalry divisions, he returned with the other to the centre, where bad news was awaiting him. As mentioned, at around the same time that 4th Corps on the left had advanced, Bellegarde's 1st Corps had occupied Adeclar without incident, and soon enough the village was reinforced with several battalions of infantry, whilst 2 batteries supported by cavalry were positioned on the right. These guns, along with more upon the heights near Wagram, began to fire upon Bernadotte's Saxons, forcing the Marshal to refuse both of his flanks, and to deploy his own artillery to the front to trade fire, but coming under an enfilading barrage, the Saxons seemed to get the worst of it. The noise of this artillery duel had drawn Napoleon, who was angered to find Adeclar, the village on which his entire line was pivoting, now in the hands of the Austrians. He rode over to Marshal Massena, who, having injured himself falling from his horse a few days earlier, was directing his troops from an open carriage pulled by a set of magnificent white horses. His 4th Corps had been ordered to close in on the centre and link with Bernadotte during the early hours of the morning, and they were now ordered to recapture Adeclar. Massena commanded his 2nd Division to storm the village, whilst a brilliant charge by General Marolat, commanding the Corps cavalry, took out the Austrian guns threatening this advance. Soon enough, a combination of French and Hessian infantry had recaptured Adeclar, but their enthusiasm proved too strong, for they pursued the Austrians beyond the confines of the village and were counterattacked by a combination of cavalry and grenadiers, the latter of which pushed the French back into the village. A brutal hand-to-hand melee ensued, resulting in an Austrian victory, as well as both the 4th Line and 24th Legere regiments losing their eagles, and only a countercharge by Saxon cavalry saved the French and Hessian infantry from being completely annihilated as they fled from the village. Bernadotte had not been idle during this attack, and had ordered Dupaz's French division, now finally back under his command, as well as several Saxon battalions, to swing north of Adeclar, but the artillery upon the Wagram heights caused them much trouble, and the counter-attack that threw back Massena's troops also tumbled back the Saxons, and Bernadotte himself had to lead forward some cavalry to help cover his panicked infantry and see off the pursuing Austrian horsemen. Unfortunately for Bernadotte, given the fact that his corps had suffered heavy casualties the previous evening, and having been under cannon fire since daybreak, their morale was broken, and this retreat quickly turned into a rout for both the Saxon and French infantry battalions under his command. The Marshal rode after them, calling out and trying to get them to rally, but it was not possible in the moment. Napoleon, who after ordering the initial attack on Adeclar had ridden back over to watch the commencement of Davout's advance on the right, returned to the centre just as it was crumbling, as streams of troops, many of them Saxon but also some French, flooded past him. He rode amongst them calling for them to rally, at which point he ran into Bernadotte, who was attempting to do the same. Was this the scientific manoeuvre by which you were going to make the Archduke Charles lay down his arms? Bernadotte then supposedly replied that having been denied any form of support, the resulting retreat was an inevitable consequence of the continued negligence at Imperial headquarters. As mentioned in the intro, Marbot in his memoir states that Napoleon's reply to these complaints was to dismiss Bernadotte from the army, but this was not the case. It does seem extremely likely, however, that the two men did share an exchange of insults and harsh words at this point on the battlefield. The historian Barton, in his biography of Bernadotte, writes the following: "It was said that the Marshal, in complaining of the taking away of his reserve, remarked cuttingly that the army was no longer what it had been in 1795, i.e. in the pre-Napoleonic era. Napoleon replied sarcastically, 'My army has always been the same, but there are some men in it whom I no longer recognize.'" There are also rumours of many other things being said, but as Barton excellently concludes, it is difficult to know what to believe. It would be unsafe to accept unreservedly all these gossipy tales, but there seems to be no doubt that the battlefield of Wagram was the scene of angry recriminations, and that bitter things were said which were either heard by the personages concerned or reported to them. As far as I can tell, this clash with Napoleon was Bernadotte's final act in the Battle of Wagram, for although Saxon and French sources disagree on the manner of the retreat, with the former calling it an organised withdrawal, whilst the latter called it a full-blown rout, the truth, as always, most likely lies somewhere in the middle. The Saxon cavalry and artillery certainly played their part in halting the immediate Austrian pursuit, but the infantry, for all of their efforts over the past few days, had finally reached their breaking point. In any event, except for the artillery, the Saxon corps was out of action by noon and took no further part in the Battle of Wagram. The remaining 11 guns under Birnbaum's command were ordered into the front line again at about 3 p.m. and took up firing positions on the left of some French batteries near Gerasdorf until night brought an end to the fighting. The remainder of the corps collected itself around Rasdorf until evening, when it marched west to bivouac for the night near Leopoldo. As a note here, in the footnotes to Thunder on the Danube, written after this above statement, which is taken from With Eagles to Glory, Gill, the author of both works, notes the following in reference to the Saxon involvement in the remainder of the battle. The cavalry's role is unclear. The probability that some may have been on hand in the afternoon is a change from Eagles. Therefore, it seems likely that at the very least a few elements of the Saxon cavalry and artillery did still play a part in the battle, but as a cohesive force, 9th Corps was no longer able to contribute, and considering that after this point Bernadotte is no longer mentioned in any of the sources that I have used, I can only assume that he spent the remainder of the day trying to rally his much scattered infantry, and thus attempting to re-establish a battle-worthy command. Although this video is centered around Bernadotte, before we move on to discussing the event that did lead to him eventually being dismissed from the army, it seems rude not to at least conclude this brief overview of the Battle of Wagram, despite our main character no longer featuring in it. With the retreat of Bernadotte's 9th Corps and the loss once again of Adeclar, the French centre was in serious jeopardy. After doing what he could to rally and restore the faith of the men, Napoleon conferred with Massena and ordered him to once again launch an attack upon Adeclar, which he identified as being a vital pivot for the entire battle. Although the fresh French division sent in by Massena retook the village, they were unable to hold it, for despite heroic efforts, an unending Austrian pressure once more forced them out by 11 a.m. As if this wasn't bad enough, the two Austrian corps nearest the Danube were finally in position to make their presence felt. Collerat's 3rd Corps reached Breton-Lee in time to tie down Legrand's division, the remaining fresh troops from Massena's corps, with a heavy artillery bombardment. Fortunately for the French, the Austrian commander then followed his orders strictly to the letter, and instead of pressing home the obvious advantage, he waited for Clenau's 6th Corps to fall into line to his south. Clenau was moving slowly but with purpose, and although Boudet put up a strong defence with his solitary division, the Austrians soon captured Aspern, sending the French fleeing, in part towards Essling, whilst the remainder fled southwards. The Austrian 6th Corps attempted to probe towards this southern bridgehead, but a heavy shelling from the multiple batteries on Lebeau Island quickly dissuaded any moves in this direction. Nonetheless, this offensive had put the French in serious danger, for the Austrians were threatening to either cut them off from Lebeau Island altogether, or if 6th Corps turned north, then it could attack the rear of the French army. Once more, however, the Austrian commander, dissuaded from getting too close to the guns of Lebeau, and lacking any definite orders, decided to halt and await further instruction from Charles as to the direction his advance should take. At this critical moment of the battle, whilst the Austrians faltered in pushing through the initiative which they had so boldly taken, Napoleon sprang to life, and immediately set to seize it back. Although the Emperor's situation was dire, he reacted coolly and promptly with a series of bold and astonishing decisions. Having faith that Davout's attack would turn the Austrian position upon the Russbach Heights, Napoleon believed that Charles would be forced to then strengthen this part of his line with troops from his centre, and therefore it would be in the centre where Napoleon would strike. This striking force would consist of MacDonald's corps from the Army of Italy, supported by cavalry, as well as a follow-up attack from General Werder's Bavarian division, along with the divisions of the Young and Middle Guard. However, before this could take place, Davout's attack had to have pushed beyond the Markgraf Neusiedl tower on the Russbach Heights, and more pressingly, Napoleon had to stabilise his entire left flank. For this, he noted with pleasure that his son-in-law Eugene, commanding the army of Italy, had already turned part of this force 90 degrees to the west to stem any further Austrian advances from Adeclar. To deal with the threat in the south, however, by the two Austrian corps of Collerat and Clanau, he would need more men. Being reluctant to commit his precious reserves so early to counter such a threat, he instead conceived of the idea of having Massena's corps disengage from the action around Adeclar and then march south to recapture Aspern and drive the Austrians back along the Danube. Although this sounds simple in principle, the practicalities of such a move would require multiple other steps. The first was to actually disengage the corps without the Austrians being able to exploit such a move, and to prevent this from taking place, Napoleon ordered Marshal Bessières, commanding the reserve cavalry in the absence of its usual leader Marshal Murat, to cover Massena's disengagement. Bessières rose to the occasion and personally led forward a heavy cavalry division consisting of cuirassier and carabinier straight into the Austrian lines. Under a withering fire they sustained heavy casualties, including their leader, who was knocked unconscious and initially feared dead, much to the dismay of the army, particularly the guard of whom he was their usual commander. However, this brave charge, though achieving little to no gain of ground, had occupied and deterred the Austrians, and thus had bought time and space for Massena to disengage and begin his march south. Unfortunately for Napoleon, Bessières fell wounded during one of these charges, depriving the emperor of an overall cavalry commander. As at Aspern, however, Napoleon's purpose was not to break the Austrian line, but to keep the Whitecoats at bay so his tactical combinations could ripen. The next problem, however, was that such a move to the south would entail Massena's corps marching across the line of the Austrian Third Corps, and so to complement Fourth Corps' light cavalry in covering such a move, Napoleon attached Saint-Sulpice's heavy cavalry division to Massena's command. The final problem was that this move by Massena, as well as the time it would take for MacDonald's corps to form for the attack, would leave an obvious gap in the French line, but for this Napoleon came up with a novel solution. Supposedly summoning forward General Lauriston, he pointed at the developing gap and told him, 1,000 cannonballs there. He ordered his aide to group together all of the guns of the guard, as well as some from the army of Italy, plus the Bavarian 12-pounders, in order to form a massive grand battery of over 100 guns, which would stretch for nearly 2,000 yards, quite the imposing spectacle. One could not speak of batteries because the entire front seemed to be one deployed battery. The idea of this grand battery, however, went further than just covering space and plugging a gap, for Napoleon also ordered that the guns were to slowly leapfrog their way forward so as to press the Austrians back and ideally open up a space for MacDonald's attack to exploit. In all, it was a remarkable scheme conceived in a moment of near crisis. But as Gill rightly says, such ideas were useless without the ability to execute them, and for this Napoleon was fortunate to have such competent and confident subordinates and soldiers. The depth of mind, thinking several steps ahead of the enemy, and the facility of imagination necessary to conceive of this vast operation on the spot were remarkable enough, but the superb leadership on the part of his subordinates and the tactical competence of his army complemented Napoleon's personal qualities. The emperor could issue his intricate instructions with confidence. Immediately upon receiving the order, the trumpets of the guard horse artillery rang out, and the horses were spurred forward as they galloped into position, followed by the foot batteries and soon joined by the artillery of the line. They unlimbered under fire at a range of about 400 to 600 yards, and began to unleash a torrent of heavy canister and round shot into the Austrian lines, disabling enemy guns and knocking down man and horse with an effect that halted the notion of any Austrian advancement in this sector. However, this grand battery didn't have things entirely their own way, as it attracted much fire, and in particular the heavier guns situated upon the heights near Wagram, the same guns that had caused Bernadotte's corps problems earlier in the day, were able to pour a devastating enfilading fire into this gun line, causing heavy casualties amongst the crew and officers in command. With several senior officers wounded, including Drouot and d'Abbeville, whose right arm was torn off, in all, 28 officers were put out of action, and with gun crews seriously weakened, Napoleon called for volunteers from the infantry of the guard. He asked for 20 men from each company, An average of 50 stepped forward, double time to the guns, and according to Drouot, behaved with the greatest gallantry. Nor was Napoleon immune to this fire. Situated just behind the gun line, on the slight rise in the ground behind Adeclar, overshots aimed at the Grand Battery would frequently bounce towards and through his position, injuring many of his staff as he remained close enough to the front to inspire the men, whilst also making minor adjustments to his plans. He remained stoic, and at one point, when a bouncing ball knocked off the shako of a staff officer, he smiled, telling the man, "It's a good thing you are not taller." However, despite the ferocity of the fighting and the complexity of the movements going on around him, unmoved upon his white horse, his eyeglass was trained upon events on the opposite side of the battlefield, where fortunately things were starting to improve for the French, for Davout's attack had finally got underway and was beginning to make ground, albeit slowly. As he had agreed with Napoleon earlier on, Davout had spent a few hours to get his troops prepared and into the appropriate positions before launching his attack. He first sent much of his light cavalry to the right and across the Russbach, whilst 2 of his 4 infantry divisions also marched east before crossing the Russbach. The final 2 divisions were in position to assault and capture the village of Markgraf-Neusiedl, and as soon as his artillery had neutralized the Austrian guns situated on the plain, Davout personally led these 2 divisions across the Russbach and into the village, whilst Friant and Moran began to pivot and attack the ridgeline beyond the village and from the east. Rosenberg, commanding the Austrian 4th Corps defending this sector, was not going to be shifted from his position with ease, though the flanking move by Davout did force him to move troops over to defend the eastern approaches, and thus weaken slightly the position around Markgraf-Neusiedl, which was soon set on fire by Davout's preliminary bombardment. Whilst the French cavalry, commanded by General Montbrun, clashed and overthrew their Austrian counterparts on the extreme flank, Moran began his attack on the heights, and although initially repulsed, support from Friant ensured their eventual capture. Meanwhile, Davout led the other 2 divisions into the burning village, flushing out the Austrians who retreated to the next strong position, marked by a tower on the heights above the village. It was just after midday that this second position was taken, and although Charles himself led forward reinforcements brought from 2nd Corps, it was now too late to save the situation, and these fresh troops were merely able to defend 4th Corps as it retreated northwest, in the hopes of establishing a new defensive line. It would prove, however, too late, for Davout's success meant that he could move his artillery onto the heights and begin to enfilade the remaining Austrian positions, whilst his infantry and cavalry continued to press and turn the position. Napoleon, watching from near Adeclar, was also well aware what Davout's success meant, for as soon as he spotted the clouds of smoke which indicated the infantry battle had moved past the tower, he signalled for the main offensive to begin. At the heart of this attack was to be what is commonly referred to as MacDonald's column, which I'm actually a little confused as to how exactly it would have looked. I think every diagram that I have seen has it looking something like this. However, both Petre and Gill describe the column as looking a little different. It consisted chiefly of the 2 divisions of MacDonald's corps, commanded by the generals Lamarck on the left and Brosier on the right. Each division contributed 4 battalions to the front, with each placing 2 in front and 2 behind, whilst each individual battalion deployed into a 3-ranked line. The remaining battalions of each division were then placed in columns of division, the typical French attack column, one behind the other on either flank. Therefore, whilst the images show the right flank as being longer than the left, if Brosier was on the right, as Petre and Gill claim, then as his division was smaller than Lamarck's, it would be the left flank that was the longer flank, meaning that it would actually be a mirror image of how it is usually portrayed in the diagrams. Supporting what was essentially a corps-level order mixed formation, but not directly connected to it, was an attached division commanded by General de Brigade Serrat, who had replaced the wounded Moreau. This division, again marching with its battalions in attack columns, was simply in position to be brought forward to either support or exploit openings as the opportunities presented themselves. This formation is usually described as a clumsy mass, and an example of both the deterioration of French infantry as well as the French's increasing reliance upon heavy formations to simply smash through the enemy. However, neither of these are apt descriptions of what was taking place. We have already seen Massena's infantry able to extract itself from combat, pivot 90 degrees and begin to march south across the face of the enemy, while MacDonald's own divisions had first pivoted from the Rustbach line to face Adderclaw in order to fill the space vacated by Bernadotte's Saxons, before now forming into a new mixed formation, including a front of deployed lines in order to commence an assault. Clearly these were not raw infantry incapable of manoeuvring. The size of the square was a drawback in that it made a fine artillery target, but it was hollow, not solid like a true column or an Austrian mass. Nor was it as inflexible as commonly portrayed, something the Habsburg squadrons learned when they attempted to penetrate its ranks and were stopped by well-delivered musketry. For all the controversy, therefore, the formation MacDonald chose, while not ideal, was suited to tactical conditions where he would have to advance quickly and powerfully, contend with threats from three sides, and fend off the numerous and courageous enemy cavalry. As Gill says here, the Austrian cavalry had a very difficult time trying to break this column, and in several accounts their attacks upon the flanks were met with a firm resistance from the French. Apparently the companies on the flanks, upon spotting the advancing cavalry, merely halted, pivoted to face the threat, unleashed a well-timed and devastating volley, and then returned to their forward facing before resuming the advance. Unfortunately though for MacDonald and the French, one of the reasons that this formation received such a poor reputation is simply because of its performance, though this was not entirely the fault of either the formation nor its commander, but simply the circumstances into which it was launched. MacDonald's objective was to be the gap between the Austrian 1st and 3rd Corps, with the bell tower of Sussenbrunn as his point of direction. However, the Austrian commanders couldn't help but spy the construction of this formation, particularly as cavalry was brought in to support its flanks, and were therefore well prepared for MacDonald's advance. Regardless, the French marched forward, maintaining their order despite a galling fire, but as they approached the Austrian positions, the two Austrian corps simply refused and pulled back their flanks, thus drawing the French into a cauldron of fire. Despite the mounting casualties and his exposed position, MacDonald had theoretically dented the Austrian line, and thus called for his supporting cavalry to charge, but it was here where he was to be let down. First, Nonsuit on the left with his heavy cavalry division was tardy in moving forward and thus missed the opportunity. And then, and even worse, the Guard cavalry supporting the right simply refused to charge on the orders of MacDonald, claiming that the Guard only moved by the command of Bessières, who was currently unconscious and being carried from the field, or the Emperor, who was obviously not in the immediate vicinity. Thus any potential opportunity was lost. Napoleon was, however, watching on, and was disgusted by the behaviour of his cavalry, who had so frequently been a crux upon which he could rely upon in times of crisis. "They have never done anything like this to me. They will cause this day to end without results." Fortunately for the French, things were going better elsewhere on the field. As stated, Davout's progress on the right had been the signal for an all-out offensive by the French, and although Massena around this time had sent an ADC to Napoleon, reporting that Essling had now been lost, Napoleon sent the messenger straight back to implore the Marshal to attack, for the battle was won. Massena duly obliged, and sent his divisions into action, Legrand taking back Essling with the help from the now relieved Boudet, while Saint-Cyr and Moliteau attacked the other elements of the Austrian Sixth Corps. Together they eventually drove the Austrians out of Aspern and chased them back along the Danube. Although the infantry was largely unengaged after evicting the Whitecoats from Essling and Aspern, the artillery chased Clanau's troops and the light cavalry was extremely active. With support from Saint-Sulpice heavies, Lasalle and Marolat continually harassed and charged the retiring Austrians. Meanwhile, Napoleon had ordered Duret's division from the Army of Italy to move south and support Massena's right flank during this operation, while Pacot's division, again from the Army of Italy, was to attack Wagram itself. The Emperor also directed Werder's Bavarians, along with elements of his young guard, to support MacDonald as best they could. Facing the Rustbach, up until this point, General Oudinot's Second Corps had been content with exchanging artillery fire with the Austrian Second Corps, but with Davout's attack now well underway and threatening the Austrian flank, Oudinot took his chance and threw his troops forward, and once upon the heights he swung a division west to help Pacot take Wagram. Marshal Davout, as his corps continued to drive the Austrians back across the plateau, had effectively secured victory for the French. The only thing left to decide was just how conclusive it could be. In this matter, however, the Austrians still had a say. Charles was no fool, and although he had tried to prevent the collapse of his left, he ultimately knew that Davout's mounting of the heights signalled the end of any hopes he had of holding this position. Therefore, rather than letting his army be crushed, he gave orders for a cohesive withdrawal towards the west, and the strong position offered around the Biasenberg. There was also another factor that would influence the outcome of the battle, and that was fatigue. By this point, this second day of the battle had been raging for nearly 12 hours, and the infantry in particular were completely exhausted, for the weather had been exceptionally hot and dry, and the constant firing of their weapons left them extremely thirsty. Therefore, by mid to late afternoon, the battle had effectively ended with the Austrian 1st, 2nd and 4th Corps pushed back across the Russbach, but now taking up a strong position on the high ground to the west, whilst the rest of the Austrian army had likewise fallen back to this higher ground. The casualties amongst both sides was also horrendous, with the Austrians losing an estimated 38,870 men, and the French 35,060 men across the 2 days. Many recognised that Wagram had been extraordinary, perhaps unprecedented, in its scope, scale, ferocity and cost. Both sides had understandably had enough, and the battle therefore naturally petered out. The French positions were stretched in a concave from Jeddah Sea on the Danube up to Bockfliss in the north, whilst the Austrian positions essentially mirrored them. There was one final event for the day, when between 4 and 5 p.m, elements of Archduke John's advance guard finally arrived on the very eastern part of the battlefield. It was by now far too late, and the Austrian army had already been pushed back to the Biasenberg hills, and after encountering a strong French presence in Ober-Siebenbrunn, John decided to withdraw back north and attempt to link up with Charles' army via a less direct route. This sudden appearance of Austrian troops to their rear did cause momentary panic amongst elements of the French army, particularly the supply train, and Napoleon was alarmed, for he had estimated John's strength to be above 30,000, but when reports confirmed that it was closer to 10,000 and that they were already retreating, his fears were alleviated. Despite occupying relatively strong positions, and with his brother John finally within touching distance, Charles had no desire to extend the cost in human life with a third day of battle, and decided to issue orders for an orderly retreat during the night. For his part, Napoleon was in no position to order a close pursuit, nor to even particularly hamper Charles's plans, for a number of reasons. For one, he was wary of the strong position which the Austrians now occupied, and was especially wary of attacking them in the dark. 2. He knew that he would have to secure his communications, as well as Vienna itself, before conducting any form of pursuit northwards. 3. His army required replenishing their supplies, particularly the ammunition, with the artillery estimated to have fired over 100,000 rounds, the guard alone contributing over 15,000 of that. And finally, he understood that his men were simply exhausted after a series of forced marches in the days leading up to the battle, and then 2 days of combat which had finally worn out both horse and man completely. Therefore, as the French held their positions and got what sleep they could, the Austrian army was able to pass away unchallenged into the night. Wagram was Napoleon's last decisive victory. It compelled Austria to make peace, but it was no Austerlitz, Auerstadt or Jena, where the enemy's armies had been destroyed. Archduke Charles managed to disengage the greater part of his army in good order, and Napoleon came away with a new respect for the Austrians. Before we finally return to the main purpose of this video, discussing and analysing the events surrounding Bernadotte in all of this, I just want to quickly sum up the remainder of the campaign, because as Rothenberg alludes to in the above quote, despite it being a French victory, Wagram did not immediately bring about peace in the way that Austerlitz did, nor did it destroy the Austrian army as Napoleon had hoped during his intensive pre-planning. As mentioned, dawn on the 7th revealed that Charles had slipped away, leaving behind only a rear guard, but even still Napoleon was both reluctant and unsure of how to immediately proceed. Napoleon spent most of the 7th of July reordering his army on the Marchfeld, ensuring care of the wounded, arranging the security of Vienna and his southern flank, notifying the larger world of his victory at Wagram, and trying to gather intelligence on Charles's whereabouts. He also made speeches to some of the men and gave rewards for courage, including awarding MacDonald his Marshal's baton for his conduct on the previous day, much to the delight of the army. As Gill mentions, Napoleon was unsure as to the route which Charles had taken, and so sent out probes in the two most likely directions, but even this provided scarce and contradictory information, as Austrians were contacted along both routes. Therefore he decided to send out two pursuing forces, Massena to the west towards Stockerau, and Marmont to the north heading towards Brunn. Charles had actually chosen to withdraw with his main army first west and then on towards Znaim, with his initial aim being to hold a strong position at Jetzeldorf on the river Pulka. Over the next few days the French followed with renewing vigour, and each day saw the respective advanced and rear guards clash. Marmont had been following Rosenberg, who swung his corps northwest towards La so as to protect the left flank of the main army, but Charles was annoyed by this decision to thereby leave open the road to Brunn and ordered him back to defend it. Therefore, after a brief clash at La, Rosenberg crossed the Pulka and turned northeast, and thus away from the main army. His pursuer, Marmont, actually misread these movements, and incorrectly presuming that the Austrians were massing upon Znaim, he promptly moved across the river and towards the town. When news of this reached Charles, he was understandably alarmed, for his position at Jetzeldorf was now outflanked, and worse, his main route of retreat was threatened if Marmont could reach Znaim before him. He therefore rushed his forces back, and on the 10th of July he arrived with enough troops to meet Marmont east of the town and hold him back. In fact, the Austrians held the numerical advantage, but worried about his line of retreat, Charles thought only of defence, and besides, the boldness of Marmont's advance and subsequent attacks upon the position further deceived him as to the French general's true strength. The following day saw the Austrians able to get the remainder of their forces across to the north side of the Thaya, but Marshal Massena was right on their tail, and his troops were able to secure the bridge and threatened to take Znaim itself. Napoleon then arrived, and knowing that he wouldn't have his main forces until the following morning, he ordered Marmont and Massena to conduct offensive moves to keep the Austrians in place. By evening, however, political events had changed matters, for peace talks had been ongoing since Wagram, and as the light was beginning to fade on this second day of the battle, officers from both sides rode amongst their men, calling for a ceasefire, for an armistice had been agreed between the two sides. This then led to a peace treaty, and thus an end to the costly war of 1809. To return at last to Bernadotte's story, we must return to the evening of the conclusion of the Battle of Wagram, where Bernadotte's Saxons had finally rallied and reformed around Rasdorf. They were then ordered to march to Leopoldo, where they spent the night. Bernadotte noticed that his men were particularly downbeat after having suffered such heavy casualties and having been forced to retreat, that he felt the need to address them as follows. "I wish to lead you to a field of honour. You have done all that I had a right to expect from you, but they will not do you justice because you were under my command." Whilst Bernadotte's intentions were most likely to restore the faith of his men, the final line was perhaps not the wisest of choices, for it implanted injustice into the minds of men who were already beginning to question their place in this imperial army after 2 days of suffering. The chagrin of the corps and its commander, which these words expressed, was aggravated when the emperor published his bulletin. It does not appear to have been unjust to the Saxons. It gave them credit for having carried the village of Rasdorf on the 5th of July, and they had no right to complain that nothing was said of the part which they took in the battle on the 6th of July. But, smarting under their heavy losses, they resented Napoleon's audacious underestimate of his killed at 1,500 and of his wounded at 3,000 or 4,000 only. As Barton says, this was not particularly unjust for the Saxons, for although their cavalry and artillery did continue to play a role on the second day of the battle, as we saw above, the majority of the corps was out of action for practically all of the key events on the second day, and so were unlikely to receive much praise. Bernadotte, however, was determined to restore the morale of his own troops, and issued his own order of the day, dated 7th of July. Saxons, on the day of the 5th of July, between 7,000 and 8,000 of you pierced the centre of the enemy's army, and fought your way to Deutsch Wagram, in spite of the resistance of 40,000 of the enemy supported by 50 guns. You fought until midnight, and you bivouacked in the middle of the Austrian lines. On the 6th, at daybreak, you renewed the combat with the same perseverance. Amidst the ravages of the enemy's artillery, your living columns remained as motionless as bronze. The great Napoleon witnessed your devotion. He numbers you amongst his braves. Saxons, a soldier's fortune consists in doing his duty. You have nobly done yours. As you can see, this proclamation made some audacious claims, and when it was brought to Napoleon's attention, he wasn't best pleased. In reality, it no more bent the truth than many of Napoleon's own proclamations and bulletins, but along with Bernadotte's comment about the Saxons not receiving fair treatment whilst under his command, this order of the day was probably the straw that broke the camel's back when it came to the Emperor's tolerance of the Marshal's behaviour during this campaign. On the 9th of July, he therefore granted Bernadotte permission to return home for reasons of health, essentially a soft dismissal, but by no means the firing as suggested by Marbot. Most likely this would have been the matter dropped, for these sorts of orders of the day, designed to boost morale and prop up the troops under their command, were carried out by other marshals, though perhaps not quite as far-fetched as Bernadotte's, but still it was not an unusual practice in of itself. The problem arose a few weeks later when a Frankfurt newspaper, after managing to get a copy, printed Bernadotte's order of the day, and many other journals throughout Germany reprinted it as well. There is no evidence that Bernadotte was responsible, and he always disclaimed responsibility for its publication. It is probable that the German press took it up because it was a compliment to German troops. For the same reason, it was keenly resented by French generals and soldiers. The other marshals, who took no notice of the order so long as it was addressed to no larger audience than the Saxon corps, were up in arms when they read it in a public journal. Napoleon, although he had already removed Bernadotte from command, was now forced to further his punishment, for not only did this now public order of the day overly praise the Saxons, it was praising them for deeds that French troops and generals achieved, which of course he could not allow to stand unchecked. Being still in Vienna, Napoleon wrote to Henri Clark, the Minister of War, "If you have occasion for seeing the Prince of Pontecorvo, please convey to him my displeasure at the ridiculous order of the day which he has had published in all the newspapers. It is all the more out of place because he himself was complaining about the Saxons during the whole day. The order of the day contains other inaccuracies. It was General Oudinot who took Wagram on the 6th at midday, so the Prince of Pontecorvo could not have taken it. It is not true that the Saxons forced the enemy's centre on the 5th. They did not fire a shot. Speaking generally, I shall be well pleased that you should know that the Prince of Pontecorvo has not done well in this campaign. He is a man who wants riches, pleasure, greatness, but does not wish to buy them by the dangers and fatigues of war. In truth, that column of granite was constantly routed." Napoleon also felt it necessary to both quell the anger of the other marshals and to keep them in check by reminding them all who ultimately was in charge. He therefore had the following circular passed around the marshalate, but exclusively for their eyes only. His Majesty testifies his displeasure at the Marshal Prince of Pontecorvo's order of the day, dated Leopoldo on 7th of July, which has been inserted in nearly all the newspapers in the following terms. Here follows Bernadotte's order of the day. Independently of the circumstances that the Emperor commands his army in person, it belongs to him alone to assign to each one the share of glory to which he may be entitled. His Majesty owes the success of his army to the French troops and not to any foreign troops. The Prince of Pontecorvo's order of the day tends to put forward unfounded pretensions in favour of troops of a secondary description, and is contrary to the truth, to policy, and to the national honour. The success of the battle on the 6th was due to the corps of marshals the Duke of Rivoli and General Oudinot, who pierced the enemy's centre, while the Duke of Auerstadt's corps was turning their left. The village of Deutsch Wagram was not in our power on the day of the 5th. The village was taken, but not until noon on the 6th, by the corps of Marshal Oudinot. The Prince of Pontecorvo's troops did not remain motionless as brass. It was the first to beat a retreat. His Majesty was obliged to cover it by the corps of the Viceroy and by the divisions commanded by the Marshal MacDonald. It was also to that marshal that the praise is due which the Prince of Pontecorvo attributes to himself. Nevertheless, the Emperor directs that this order, which might pain the Saxons, shall remain secret, and shall only be circulated among the marshals. Gill, commenting on quoting this circular to the marshals, states the following: "It was distributed to the marshalate alone. The public, the Saxons, even Rainier, were kept ignorant of its contents. General Rainier is specifically mentioned because it was he who was given command of the Saxons after Bernadotte's dismissal. These actions by Napoleon seem to have satisfied him somewhat, for the matter was not brought up again, though this is probably because at this point he had much more important issues on his mind, such as securing a peace treaty with Austria, reprimanding Russia for failing to provide much support during the campaign, as well as considering his dynasty, for the need of an heir meant the divorcing of his beloved Josephine and searching for a new wife. In regards to Bernadotte, the events of 1809 did not reflect the best of him, and his dismissal from the army was certainly a low point in this relationship with Napoleon. It would not, however, be the end of their relationship, for there were to be several more twists in the tale before Bernadotte was to leave France and become the Crown Prince of Sweden, but those are tales for a different video. Here we must analyse the events of this 1809 campaign, and discuss if Bernadotte was, as he claimed, a victim of a hidden hand and unfair treatment from imperial headquarters, or whether Napoleon was perfectly justified in firing him after Wagram. Firstly, we will look at the command as a whole and deal with a host of issues that continuously crept up before we assess Bernadotte's performance during the specific actions of the campaign. Bear in mind here that unlike in the previous Bernadotte video discussing the events surrounding Jena and Auerstadt, where there were orders and commands that we could track, the events of this campaign are much more subjective, and much of what follows tends to be my own thoughts and analysis rather than strict facts. Therefore, the first question is, was Napoleon right in giving Bernadotte command of the Saxon contingent? Bernadotte would of course immediately answer no here, but let's take a look. You may recall that Bernadotte was actually ill in bed when he first received his summons to the army, and at first it may seem callous or cruel for Napoleon to do this, but remember that most of his army and many of his marshals and commanders were currently in the Spanish peninsula, and Austria's aggression on the Danube required whoever was available, and it was most likely necessity that made him summon the marshal. It was also possible that Napoleon simply wasn't aware that Bernadotte was ill, as news didn't exactly travel fast in those days. Regardless, Bernadotte saw this assignment as beneath him, and initially refused it as he believed that he was always given such rough assignments, and in particular always given command of foreign troops. We shall address the second part of this complaint in a moment, but the idea that this was a punishment is difficult to find credence with. In the first place, Bernadotte believed that he was being kept away from high commands by a hidden hand in imperial headquarters, but as Barton in his biography of Bernadotte points out, Napoleon's own correspondence with Berthier at this time suggests that Bernadotte was in place for a much more important command, but circumstances prevented it. It appears from the Emperor's instructions to Berthier dated 30th of March 1809 that Napoleon intended, if Marshal Lannes should not be able to come to Germany from Spain, to give Bernadotte the command of the 2nd Army Corps, which was the crack corps of the army and was to be its vanguard. His directions to Berthier were, the 2nd Corps under the command of the Duke of Montebello or of the Prince of Pontecorvo shall be composed as follows, and he then details its composition. 2nd Corps was a very strong, heavily French corps, and the fact that Bernadotte was considered to command it should Lannes fail to arrive in time from Spain is surely an indictment of Napoleon's faith in him, and shows that he wasn't relegating him to a seemingly lesser command on purpose. Also, although I'm certain that Bernadotte would never have admitted to this, but being second to Lannes, at least in my opinion here, speaks in no bad way to the abilities of Bernadotte. There were few if any better corps commanders in the French army at this point, save perhaps for Davout, and Lannes' performance during this campaign, up until his unfortunate death at Aspern-Essling, totally justified Napoleon in recalling him from Spain and reserving such a command for his arrival. To tackle the second part of Bernadotte's supposed argument, that he was only ever given foreign troops, we can take a look at his record of command under Napoleon. In 1805 he was given command of 1st Corps, which consisted entirely of French troops, so he could have no complaints there. During the campaign, the Bavarian Corps were attached to his command, giving him foreign troops much to his frustration, but this made much sense for two reasons. The first is that Bernadotte and Marmont's corps were the only ones that naturally linked up with the Bavarians, who had fled north away from the Austrians. Therefore, attaching them to one of these corps was logical. Secondly, Bernadotte was senior to Marmont in rank, and therefore was trusted with overall command of this wing, and thus the Bavarians were naturally placed under his command. Bernadotte may have had difficulties controlling and working with them. I haven't looked deeply into it enough to truly know if this was the case or who was at fault if it was, but regardless, their being placed under his command was not a malicious ploy by imperial headquarters to lump him with foreign troops, but merely logical sense given the situation at hand. By the time of Austerlitz, he had left the Bavarians behind anyway, and was back to operating with an entirely French corps for the battle. The following year, during the initial campaign in Saxony that centred around Jena and Auerstadt, Bernadotte was again in command of an entirely French First Corps, the command of which he maintained until May 1807, when it was still a French corps and not a foreign command. True enough, the small force under his command in North Germany during 1808 did consist mainly of foreign troops, but that was because much of Le Grand Armée had been sent to Spain, and with peace operating within Bernadotte's sector in Central Europe, first-rate troops were not necessary. However, when we get to 1809 and our campaign in question, then yes, obviously Bernadotte was given a fully foreign command, but I think it is fair to say that prior to this he hadn't been hard done to in terms of command, and had controlled a majority French force for most of the previous campaigns. In fact, it was other marshals and generals in these previous campaigns who had been obliged to command foreign troops. For example, Lannes during the Friedland campaign had a Saxon division attached to his corps, and Napoleon's brother Jerome, though not a marshal, had commanded 9th Corps during the 1807 campaigns, which consisted of a combination of Bavarian and Württemberg troops, augmented with French artillery. Nor was Bernadotte the only commander to receive command of a complete foreign corps during this 1809 campaign, for 7th Corps was entirely Bavarian and commanded by Marshal Lefebvre, and 8th Corps entirely of Württembergers and commanded by General of Division Van Damme. Although Van Damme had commanded the Württembergers before, though apparently they disliked his harsh nature, being given a corps command as a general of division was probably seen as a nice responsibility, and so he did not complain, and by campaign's end he had to admit to the good quality of the Württembergers. However, for Marshal Lefebvre, this was not his first time commanding foreign troops, for his 10th Corps for the siege of Danzig was of mixed nationalities, as was the 4th Corps that he commanded in Spain the previous year, which consisted of French, German, Dutch and Polish troops. Although he was to be without any French troops for the first time during this campaign in 1809, we hear none of the complaining about his command in the same fashion that we do with Bernadotte. However, what made Bernadotte's appointment, at least in his own eyes, particularly troublesome was that the Saxons simply lacked quality, something which the historian Gill does seem to initially concur with. In assessing the Saxon army of 1809, several glaring weaknesses are apparent. The cavalry proved professional, brave and tactically competent, but the infantry and artillery, while sharing the quality of courage with their mounted brothers, were poorly trained and burdened with obsolete tactical precepts that severely limited their usefulness on the battlefield. The Schützen, being a well-trained elite, were a notable exception to this general rule. Fighting with skill and determination at both Wagram and Stampfen, they earned the praise of French and Austrians alike, and showed themselves far superior to their line comrades. Under good leadership, such as that provided by the aggressive von Gutschmidt, the Saxons could perform adequately, but exposed on the Marchfeld under Bernadotte's hesitant command, they suffered cruelly and faltered. It should be noted as well that the generals of the Saxons were rather mixed in terms of their abilities, with many of them being old and in positions acquired via status as opposed to proven ability. Bernadotte's restructuring of the corps prior to Wagram, by combining regiments and battalions together, did alleviate some of these issues and allowed him to be rid of some of the older, more inept officers, but still the quality of the Saxon commanders was definitely varied. To these problems, I would also add that the artillery in particular lacked the true mobility required for Napoleonic combat, nor did the corps have enough heavy guns to form a solid reserve. Therefore, Bernadotte in his complaints to imperial headquarters was quite justified in requesting more artillery, as he was in asking for more French infantry to make up for the obvious deficiencies that were to be found in the loose order fighting abilities of his Saxon line battalions. However, his constant insistence that he could do nothing with these men was in my opinion a little far-fetched, for the cavalry were very good, and the infantry and artillery lacked nothing in bravery nor determination, and their limitations were arguably known to a commander who should have utilised them with more care, hence Gill's final comment in the above quote, but we shall get to Bernadotte's own battlefield performance shortly. Therefore, generally, with all of this in mind, was Napoleon right in giving Bernadotte command of the Saxons? Again, this is purely subjective, but I genuinely think that at the time he was a good choice for such a command for two reasons. Firstly, he had been a military governor in various parts of German-speaking territory for multiple years, and in each place had earned the respect of the citizens underneath him, as Gill explains. As a military governor in the Hanseatic towns from 1807 to 1809, he had gained extensive experience in dealing with Germans and was renowned for his courtesy, charm, and adroit handling of difficult civil-military problems. Therefore, it was understandable to expect that he could extract the same appreciation from German troops under his command, and essentially this is exactly what took place. Despite his many grumblings to imperial headquarters, the Saxons themselves, unaware of these complaints, became utterly devoted to Bernadotte as their commander, and consistently defended and praised him during and after the campaign. In fact, when they heard that Bernadotte had been relieved of command, they were apparently inconsolable. One Saxon officer wrote the following to his sister about the marshal's dismissal. The grief and consternation over this completely unexpected development is great and widespread. Officers and soldiers had been very attached to the prince because he cared for them and demonstrated such a concern for them at every opportunity that it seemed he himself was a Saxon and knew no higher interest than their welfare. The second reason is that for most of the 1809 campaign, 9th Corps would be operating away from the main army, and thus out of Napoleon's direct command, meaning that they would require a trusted and senior officer capable of independent command. Bernadotte certainly fit this description, and tended to prefer working alone anyway. Therefore, I do think he was quite a shrewd choice for the command of the Saxons. Moving on to the campaign itself, we can start with the lack of initial orders for Bernadotte, or notice of his impending arrival being sent to the King of Saxony, which obviously cast a poor light upon Berthier and the French general staff. Bernadotte naturally felt that this was an intentional slight, but it must be remembered that at the moment when he arrived in Dresden, things at imperial headquarters were not in the best of states. It was at this point that Napoleon was attempting to orchestrate events and movements from Paris via long-distance communication through Berthier, and a mix-up in the arrival of certain orders caused confusion and almost disaster for the French, a disaster only avoided by the solid performance of Davout and the timely arrival of Napoleon in the theatre. Therefore, although it is difficult to prove, it seems most likely that the delay in orders issued to Bernadotte at the beginning of the campaign had more to do with the general confusion surrounding imperial headquarters at the time, as opposed to a purposeful hidden hand working against the Marshal. Once in firm command, however, Bernadotte quickly earned the respect of his soldiers, saw to it that they were cared for, and his marching with them was more than adequate for the standards of the time. He arrived at Linz to help out General Van Damme and his corps of Württembergers, though the battle proved the limitations of the Saxon line regiments, and whilst the minor success may have boosted the morale of the men, their performance did little to improve Bernadotte's faith in their capabilities. After this battle, critics of Bernadotte often point to his reluctance to launch an offensive into Bohemia as instructed by Napoleon. The Marshal, however, was already raising cautions and objections. The enemy was numerically superior, this was actually accurate. Charles himself might be present. A move into Bohemia would leave Linz vulnerable, and the Saxons suffered from innumerable deficiencies. These preemptive hints and anxieties, even if partly true, left the impression in imperial headquarters that Bernadotte was establishing a set of warnings that would excuse any setback and make any success seem all the more noteworthy for having been attained against staggering odds. Although in hindsight I think that Bernadotte was probably correct in not acting out these orders, as Gill points out, his seeming lack of desire to even attempt anything, along with his already consistent complaining about his troops, was essentially fueling the annoyance that he was steadily becoming at imperial headquarters. Fortunately, he was saved from having to justify his actions by Napoleon's own failure at Aspern and Essling, which changed the nature of the situation upon the Danube, and Bernadotte was therefore ordered to move towards Vienna in preparation for a renewed crossing and the eventual Battle of Wagram. Before we get to the battle, there is one minor point to address, and that is the accusation that Bernadotte's troops were slow in crossing to the island of Le Beau and were subsequently spotted by the Austrians, thus giving away the French intentions. Palmer mentions it as follows. The storms delayed 9th Corps as it moved up from St. Polten, making Imperial headquarters complain that Bernadotte's men were, as usual, marching well behind the clock, and dawn had broken that Tuesday before the Saxons crossed the bridge into Le Beau Island. Their arrival was observed by Archduke Charles, who at once put his troops on the alert along a ring of 15 miles of fortified defences. This seems like a major blunder, for the idea was for the soldiers to cross during the night and then seek shelter upon the island during the day, thus concealing the build-up of the eventual assault. However, no other source I have seen makes any reference to this incident, and Gill, who I have come to regard as the authority on this specific campaign, makes no mention of it in either Thunder, which covers the campaign, nor in Eagles, in which a chapter covers specifically the Saxon involvement in the campaign. Therefore, and also considering that Napoleon's eventual crossing was extremely successful and the Austrians were seemingly surprised by the sheer number of troops able to cross and form on the Marchfeld on the 5th of July, it seems unlikely that Bernadotte's crossing to the island, delayed or not, had any impact upon the events that followed. 9th Corps would not form up on the Marchfeld until 2 p.m. on the 5th, but almost immediately Bernadotte had cause to complain, for troops from his corps were being detached in different directions, leaving him with a diminished command. This was a complaint that would repeat throughout the day, and Bernadotte was adamant that this was the reason for his failure in the evening, which we will address shortly. But first to tackle is this idea that it was this purposeful hidden hand again working its mischief and splitting up his command on the day of battle, simply to deny him glory. To those who have seen the previous video on Bernadotte's behaviour during the 1806 campaign, you may recall that I made a comment in there about my finding it unlikely that Imperial headquarters would purposefully sabotage its chances, either in battle or campaign, in order to hinder certain officers or to further their own reputations, and I again feel the same here, but I don't wish to go into depth on the subject again as I will just be repeating myself. However, in regards to Bernadotte believing that he was personally being singled out by a hidden hand from above when it came to his corps being stripped of men on the day of battle, a quick glance at the events of the battle, as well as in previous battles, show this not to be the case, and the detaching of troops from one corps or sector to reinforce another was a common practice upon the battlefield. For starters, prior to the crossing on the 5th, Marshal Massena had to give up one of his divisions, Le Grands, to be the diversionary attack at the original bridgehead towards Asper and Essling several days earlier. Then, on the day of the final crossing, the Marshal had to leave behind one of his Baden infantry regiments to help guard the island once the main army had crossed. These would be under General Reynier's command, who also had for this purpose 2 battalions of Saxons from Bernadotte, 2 battalions of French from Oudinot's 2nd Corps, along with the Neufchâtel battalion. Then, during the battle, we can find multiple examples of troops being shifted between corps to deal with the changing situations. Davout had also moved forward towards Wittau, and as his cavalry was not yet over, Lasalle and Marolat had helped in clearing out the Austrian detachments until they were stopped at Rützendorf. Lasalle and Marolat were both attached to Massena's 4th Corps, yet he temporarily lost command of them as Davout required their assistance. On the 2nd day of the battle, the 2nd Heavy Cavalry Division was removed from Marshal Bessieres' overall command as reserve cavalry commander and attached to Davout's 3rd Corps and therefore placed under his command. Similarly, on the 2nd day, Prince Eugene's command of the Army of Italy was essentially split entirely, as MacDonald's 5th Corps was used separately from General Grenier's 6th, and even more extreme was that Grenier's corps functioned as 3 completely separate divisions for much of the 2nd day, with the 1st Division attached to MacDonald as the rear element of his famous column, 2nd Division acting as the bridge between Massena in the south and MacDonald's corps, whilst 3rd Division attacked Wagram in the north. To give 2 brief examples outside of Wagram, at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, Marshal Soult's 4th Corps was a divided command, with 2 of his divisions under his direct control in the centre ready to storm the heights, while his other division was spread out to defend the southern part of the battlefield. As the day wore on, it was Marshal Davout that essentially commanded in this southern sector, and therefore these troops came under his command until the conclusion of the battle. Soult again at Eylau in 1807 had a divided command, as he personally had 2 divisions on the left and centre of the line, while Saint-Hilaire's division, although part of his corps, fought and operated independently on the right, receiving commands directly from Napoleon and thus bypassing Soult. It is also important to bear in mind the context of how these detachments and actions take place. I of course wasn't there, but it seems to me that it was less about picking on certain troops and more about utilising who was both closest and available. For example, when the Saxon prince Johann Chevaulegers were detached to assist Oudinot's Second Corps, I doubt that Napoleon, when he noticed that Oudinot's artillery required a cavalry screen in order to advance and deploy, purposefully went out of his way to scour his order of battle to see which troops he could use. More than likely, he just sent an ADC to the nearest cavalry unit currently unoccupied with the order to assist the artillery. I don't think that it was ever more complicated than that. However, if I wanted to be incredibly cynical, then it could even be argued that Napoleon's choice to leave Saxon infantry behind, first to help guard Le Beau Island, and second to hold Enzersdorf, was actually the fault of Bernadotte, who had spent the entire campaign telling Napoleon how useless these Saxons actually were. Therefore, during the battle, when somewhere needed guarding, arguably a secondary role, wouldn't it be perfectly logical for Napoleon to use these supposed secondary troops? However, the overall point is that detaching troops was not an uncommon practice, nor was it one reserved exclusively for the punishment of Marshal Bernadotte. Did it weaken his already understrengthened and limited corps on the first day of Wagram? Absolutely, but the battle involved more than just his 9th Corps and was spread over a vast area, thus these detachments may have proved necessary in other sectors, and given that Napoleon ultimately won the battle, it could be argued that he was right in doing what he did. Regardless, even despite these various detachments, Bernadotte and his corps did well during the afternoon of the 5th, firstly in taking the village of Rasdorf, and then in the cavalry action that cleared the Austrian cavalry from this sector of the Marchfeld. However, as the Saxons took Adeclar, we come to the first major contentious point of the battle, the evening attack. We will discuss the intentions of this attack and whether or not Napoleon was right in launching it in a moment, but first we will talk on Bernadotte's performance during this action. As we saw, although Bernadotte received the order to attack the village of Wagram at about 7 PM, he didn't launch his attack until 9 PM, as he chose to wait for his 1st Division, who had been held at Enzersdorf, to rejoin him. This delay earns him much criticism from a few historians. While Duprat, Eugene and Oudinot were straining the Austrian centre, Bernadotte was waiting for his other division and badgering Napoleon for more troops. By this delay of almost 2 hours, he missed the chance to attack Bellegarde's right at Wagram at the same time that Duprat was pressing the Austrians' left. Had Bernadotte attacked sooner, then most likely he would have caused the Austrian First Corps much trouble in trying to deal with an attack from 2 angles, but to me this criticism seems to come from hindsight. At 7 PM, Bernadotte had only his 2nd Division, which was undoubtedly the weaker of his 2 divisions, available to act. With the Austrian reserve cavalry known to be in the open ground to his left, and with much of his cavalry still reforming at Rasdorf, it is understandable that Bernadotte was hesitant to commit his troop forward until he was reinforced. His cavalry began to arrive at 8 PM, but it wasn't until 9 PM, when his 1st Division was close enough to offer support, that he finally felt able to commence his attack. However, his actions during the attack continued to come under much criticism. He demonstrated little tactical finesse when his attack was finally launched. There was no synchronized assault, no attempt to outflank the village. The Saxon brigades were thrown against Wagram piecemeal and defeated in detail. I have to admit that I find it very difficult to defend Bernadotte's conduct in this attack on Wagram, for he knew that his Saxon infantry lacked experience in loose order fighting, and yet he simply launched them headlong into the village, 1 brigade at a time. Although their bravery saw them claim a foothold, it came at a heavy cost, and they lacked the adequate support to ever expand it. It is also strange that he insisted on delaying his attack until his 1st Division arrived, and yet he still launched the attack piecemeal, and with his weaker 2nd Division in the lead. The friendly fire incident which cemented the defeat and retreat of his infantry was obviously accidental and not exactly his fault, though perhaps a more considered approach might have avoided it. This basic head-on attack also makes the delay appear worse, because although he lacked the artillery to give a proper preparatory bombardment prior to the attack, surely he could have used the 2 hours to reconnoitre and plan something more than simply trying to storm the village. I don't really know, and I dislike trying to form strong opinions on these scenarios without being on the ground, but it is difficult to understand what exactly was going on in Bernadotte's head during this evening. These events are then made worse by his statements in the aftermath of this attack, whereby he criticised Napoleon's strategy. This was obviously said in a fit of frustration at having failed in his own attack, and after a day in which he felt that his already compromised command was consistently being weakened. He again repeated his belief of a hidden hand at Imperial headquarters as the cause of this, whilst he claimed that Wagram was so clearly the key point in the position that even a sub-lieutenant would have recognised it and provided the necessary troops with which to capture it. The issue here is that Bernadotte might have been right. Wagram perhaps was the key point, and had he been given more support, then he may have been able to take it that evening, and thus split the Austrian army in two, as well as given the French a launching point upon the heights for the battle the following morning. The problem for me, at least with this argument, and perhaps I am being too picky here, is that if Bernadotte knew that he didn't have enough men to take Wagram, then why didn't he do what Davout did on the opposite flank that same evening? Marshal Davout understood that he didn't have the time to take Markgrafeneusiedl that evening without the proper preparation, and therefore when ordered to attack, he simply manoeuvred and launched a feint attack to prove that the Austrians held the position in such force that it couldn't be taken until the following morning. In contrast, Bernadotte seems to acknowledge that he doesn't have the resources, and yet throws his troops into the fire regardless. Perhaps I am being too harsh, but Davout came to his decision very quickly, whereas Bernadotte, due to his own delay, had 2 hours to consider how to attack and still failed to conceive of anything other than a costly frontal assault with troops that he knew were not of the highest calibre. I just find it difficult to defend him here. Of course, the main problem in this entire evening attack is that Napoleon himself could have saved much of this headache by simply giving his officers an idea of what the overall intention was. The fact that it is still debated today as to whether Napoleon intended this evening assault to be a real attack to break the Austrians or simply a reconnaissance in force is exactly the issue here. Personally, I don't think that it was a real attack, for even if the French had taken the heights and thus broken the Austrian army, the hastening darkness would have prevented any proper pursuit, and Charles would have once more escaped and been able to reform his army in yet another position. Therefore, to me, the evening attack was more likely a hunt for information, as well as a chance to pin the Austrians for a fresh battle the following day. However, had Napoleon made this intention clear to his commanders, particularly Bernadotte, then perhaps they would have all conducted the evening's proceedings in a manner similar to Davout, and many lives would have been saved. In short, the evening attacks were hastily conceived, and in 2 cases poorly executed. Though we now knew that the Austrians were in place and meant to fight, the lack of clarity in planning and absence of oversight in direction meant that Napoleon had purchased this information at a very high price. In regards to Bernadotte's infamous statement that he would have shifted Charles via a scientific manoeuvre, I think that it again should just generally be taken as a sign of his overall frustrations. It was misguided and poor subordination to question his superior on the eve of battle like that, and whilst Napoleon certainly noted it, I don't think he took it too seriously, for he made no comments at the time, nor did he take any action against Bernadotte. Besides, even if we do look at it for a moment, one is left to wonder how exactly Bernadotte would have turned the position on the Russbach. It certainly couldn't be turned from the left, because arguably the ground of the Biasenberg is more formidable than that above the Russbach. Plus remember that the Archduke John's force, although in reality would not have been a major factor, in Napoleon's mind at the time was thought to number 30,000 men, and therefore its presence to the northeast had to be accounted for in any plans. Should the French then push left, John's force might easily come behind, cut them from their crossings at Leboeuf, and thus pin them between the Danube, the Biasenberg, and 2 Austrian forces, so pushing the left was not really an option. A strategical flank march to the right is of no better use either, for although the Russbach stream could be crossed without pressure from the heights, Charles's right wing, as it attempted to do in the actual battle, would now have an easier time in cutting the French army off from Leboeuf, and John's army would still be a threat on its approach. Therefore I don't personally feel that there is any possible way of outflanking the position that doesn't compromise the French line of communication and links with Leboeuf. It would therefore seem a foolish comment, but as stated, I don't think that it was a literal criticism of Napoleon's actions, but more of a rambling gasconade by a tired Bernadotte, frustrated at the events of the day. The next point of discussion in this affair is Bernadotte's decision during the night to pull his troops back and essentially give up the village of Adeclar uncontested. It seems that his reasoning for this move was multifaceted. The entire army had received orders to close up, and therefore he was ordered to shift closer to Eugene to his right. He was also acutely aware that the previous evening's attack had not only cut his Saxon infantry down to just 6,000 effectives, but their morale was also in serious doubt as a result. Not wanting to hold an overextended line with shaken troops, he therefore pulled them back about 1,000 yards to the southeast, leaving just the wounded who were unable to be moved in the village. The first major issue with this decision, before we get into the rights and wrongs of it, was that Bernadotte apparently failed to inform either Napoleon nor anyone at Imperial headquarters. It is impossible to know the reason for this, because perhaps he did send an ADC who simply got lost in the dark, or the message got misplaced somehow, but given his comments throughout the day about Imperial headquarters working against him, it unfortunately seems likely, at least in my opinion, that Bernadotte just simply didn't tell anyone out of Gascon pettiness. Was he right to pull his troops back? Again, this is entirely subjective, for all of Bernadotte's reasons stated above for doing so were perfectly true, and he had no specific orders, as far as I'm aware, to hold Adeclar. However, given that villagers often form strong points upon a battlefield, giving one up for free at such a key position as the pivot point in the line seems absurd in the cold light of day. Adeclar is described by the historian Rothenberg as follows. Protected by an embankment, the village was important strategically. For the French, it was a jump-off position to take Wagram from the west, while for the Austrians it protected the right flank of the Russbach position. Not being familiar with the ground, this next point is perhaps wrong, but I find it strange that on the following day, the new Saxon position was still exposed to a heavy artillery fire, which forced Bernadotte to refuse both his flanks, in an attempt to shelter his men. I just wonder if at least part of his infantry would not have found more shelter within the buildings of Adeclar had he remained there, rather than in the open, but this is potentially false analysis, as I have never seen the village, nor the ground around it. Just a thought though. What is undeniable is that 9th Corps was much weakened, and the question can absolutely be raised of whether or not Napoleon was wise to keep them in such a key position as the pivot of his front line. Perhaps if Bernadotte had informed him of his withdrawal from Adeclar, the Emperor may have pushed other troops forward to reoccupy the village. Of course, even if Bernadotte did inform Napoleon of his weakness in this sector, then given the number of complaints that he had received throughout the campaign, the Emperor may merely have thought that Bernadotte was once again crying wolf. The Austrians, intent of attacking it in the morning, were of course surprised and delighted to find Adeclar unoccupied, and the village formed the centre point of a series of bloody attacks and counterattacks over the course of the following morning. Attacks and bloodshed which perhaps could have been reduced given better preparations and communication during the night. Regardless, the final act for Bernadotte at Wagram was in supervising a part of the first of these French attacks to retake the village, and although his infantry seems to entirely rout as a result of this, it is difficult to pinpoint anything that he does wrong. The Saxons were simply at breaking point, and given that Massena's men actually broke first during the Austrian counterattack, there is little to blame the Saxon infantry for, given that they were under a murderous crossfire of artillery. It was during his attempts to rally his infantry that Bernadotte famously clashed verbally with Napoleon, and although much is usually made of these events given its drama, I personally don't find there to be much in it. Harsh words were certainly exchanged, and Napoleon sarcastically reminded Bernadotte of his comments from the previous evening, but Napoleon had similar spats and fallouts with other marshals and generals and frequently made up with them afterwards, as these types of exchanges were, I wouldn't say frequent, but not uncommon. To give a few examples which come to mind, Napoleon in 1805 argued and moaned at Murat's performance in the vanguard, upsetting the flamboyant cavalrymen. General Sebastiani had an argument with Napoleon during the 1812 campaign when the Emperor criticised his performance, to which the cavalry general supposedly rode away and threw his sword away in disgust. Finally, even at this Battle of Wagram, Later on in the day, Napoleon was critical of his cavalry in failing to support MacDonald's column, and when he confronted General Nonsuit on the matter, the officer, supposedly indignant, replied, "It is not your majesty at any rate who can teach me to lead cavalry." Honestly, these kind of miniature arguments, particularly when they took place on the battlefield, remind me of incidents that you sometimes see, or may have experienced, in team sports where something goes wrong and teammates in the heat of the moment throw blame and criticism at each other. These encounters often look bad from the outside and frequently get blown up by the media, but once the match is finished they are usually forgotten about and the teammates continue as if nothing had happened. Essentially, tensions run high in high-pressure situations, and these things unfortunately take place. I therefore don't find this to be any different than that. It is two men venting steam at each other in a high-pressure moment, both frustrated with the other for a variety of reasons, but I don't think that either took it as seriously after the fact as historians have tended to do. Admittedly, Marbo's colourful but false account has not helped much in this regard. Napoleon mustn't have made too much of it because he made no effort to punish Bernadotte for his attitude, nor did he react to the Marshal's comments to the Saxons after the battle, telling them to expect no praise because they were under his command. Although he was clearly trying to raise the morale of his broken men, the final comment was foolish, but given his Gascon temperament, rather unsurprising, as Barton in his biography points out. His Saxon troops had done badly and had suffered severely in the battle. He was in a position to point to the many letters in which he had warned the emperor that they were not to be relied on and were unfit for any independent manoeuvre. He might have said, "I told you so," and in the face of the correspondence it would have been difficult for Napoleon to reply. But Bernadotte was always disposed to associate himself with his subordinates. Napoleon once compared him to an old corporal who complains lustily when a man is taken from his file. He remained the same to the end. What he was to his file as a corporal, he became to his regiment as a colonel, to his corps as a marshal, to his province as a governor, and to his subjects as a king. His instinct was to identify himself wholeheartedly with his men, and to take up the cudgels for them, right or wrong, contra mundum, and what was even more dangerous, contra imperatum. It was this same attitude which no doubt inspired the writing of the famous Order of the Day after his corps had received only little praise in Napoleon's bulletin. Its words were overly kind to the Saxons and stretched the truth of events close to breaking point, so much so that when it was brought to the attention of Napoleon, he recommended to the Marshal that he take a leave of absence for reasons of health. Although it would appear on the surface that it was this Order of the Day that angered Napoleon to the point of firing Bernadotte, Gill believes that the dismissal was the result of a combination of factors scattered throughout his time as a marshal, but particularly his complaining throughout this campaign, and that the Order of the Day was merely the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were. In 1809, Napoleon and Berthier must certainly have wearied of Bernadotte's jeremiad. His continual complaints, even if based in fact, often resembled excuses for inaction and were inconsistent with the hyperbolic plaudits he handed the Saxons immediately after Linz and Wagram. Furthermore, his performance in the campaign had been uninspiring. While encamped about Linz, he inflated Austrian strength and evinced little interest in pressuring the enemy in Bohemia, as Napoleon had repeatedly directed. At Wagram, he showed himself sluggish and testy. He demonstrated tremendous personal courage and made every effort to conserve the lives of his troops, but his tactical performance was poor and soldiers were needlessly sacrificed in uncoordinated, unsupported attacks on both the 5th and the 6th. The abandonment of Adeclar was a particularly egregious error. Having failed to accomplish his missions, he haughtily attempted to blame his mysterious enemies in imperial headquarters and even Napoleon himself. His dismissal being a culmination of factors rather than one key event is probably the case, for it seems that the matter would most likely have been put to bed and forgotten about had the German newspapers not reprinted the Order of the Day, angering both the French army, particularly the marshals, as well as Napoleon, who was forced to reprimand Bernadotte further via his Minister of War, Clark. Although he was accused by many of giving the Order of the Day to the newspapers, Bernadotte denied it, and honestly, given his character, I tend to believe him here. It is hearsay, and we have no proof either way that I can find, but I feel that it would have been quite out of character for him to do this. As much as he may have felt unfairly treated, and may have sided with the Saxons as the little guys here, he also had his own principles and a sense of honour that such an action would have violated, and given his Gascon nature, I doubt personally that he would have done it. Napoleon's reaction to the reprinting is interesting because as far as I can tell he doesn't write to Bernadotte nor punish him in a meaningful way, but merely tells his Minister of War to tell him off, and the circular by which he refuted the claims made in Bernadotte's order of the day was kept as a secret memo for the eyes of the Marshal only. I have no idea if Bernadotte saw this, and it would be interesting to know if he had, but I do find it noteworthy that he wanted to keep the entire affair as low-key as possible, firstly in his initial dismissal of Bernadotte for health reasons, and then keeping his own response to the Marshals a private matter. It could absolutely be argued that this could have been done for reasons of maintaining face for himself and the army, for it would have looked bad for a senior French marshal, especially one with a degree of popularity such as Bernadotte, to be outright fired and removed from the army. It does also say within the circular that it was to be kept private to prevent the dismay of the Saxon troops, who were allies of the French and whom Napoleon would need a continued loyalty moving forward. However, I do also wonder if a part of the relatively low-key disciplining of Bernadotte was simply because Napoleon didn't actually want to fall out with him too badly. For those who have seen the previous video on the nature of Bernadotte and Napoleon's relationship up to this point, you will know that whilst the two men were never best of friends, they were not the enemies that they are often portrayed to be. Bernadotte was genuinely loyal to Napoleon once he gave his word to serve him as a marshal, and Napoleon showered various gifts upon him as a reward for this. Theirs was certainly an interesting relationship, as Barton shows in his depiction of Napoleon's viewpoint prior to this 1809 campaign. It is obvious that Napoleon sometimes felt uneasy about Bernadotte's popularity and influence with the rank and file of the French army, yet there is reliable evidence that there were at times at which he contemplated selecting Bernadotte as his own successor. In fact, the Emperor's attitude of mind towards Bernadotte at this period was variable and indeterminate. Talking to Count Roederer in March 1809, in the course of a conversation which that personage recorded verbatim soon after it occurred, he said in reference to King Joseph, who was giving him trouble, "If necessary, I shall adopt a general for the purpose of sending him to Spain. I shall adopt Bernadotte, just as I have already adopted Murat." A few minutes afterwards, in reference to the succession of his own throne, he added, "I have no need of family. I shall adopt a son, a General Bernadotte. I have already adopted Murat. Nothing shall stop my destinies." It is strange that, when Napoleon's thoughts wandered outside of his own family, they fixed on Bernadotte as next in the running for a throne, even his own. Whether Napoleon would still have held this opinion and viewpoint on Bernadotte after the events of the campaign just discussed, I'm not so sure, and perhaps this fallout with the Marshal was the extra fuel that motivated Napoleon to seek a new wife who could provide him with a son, and therefore a true heir to his dynasty. However, in terms of Bernadotte, his removal from command wouldn't last long, nor would his total estrangement from the Emperor, but as I said, those are tales for next time. Bernadotte's performance during the 1809 campaign along the Danube, and in particular his actions at the Battle of Wagram, do not come into as much criticism as his supposed failure to turn up at either Jena or Auerstadt in 1806, but when examined in the cold light of day, I don't think that they present a particularly good impression of the Marshal. If anything, it is this campaign which his many critics should use if they wish to rail against him, and not 1806. It is fair to say that he was certainly given a tough assignment, for the Saxons were at this period not the strongest of contingents, lacking particular quality in the realms of artillery and line infantry. However, given Bernadotte's experience, both as a commander and as a military governor of multiple Germanic states, it was not beyond his powers to perform well and get the most out of men that were quickly won over by his natural leadership and his genuine compassion for their well-being. Unfortunately, rather than seeing the task as a chance to prove his worth, he took it upon himself to see it as a form of punishment. This mindset, aided by his conviction that Imperial headquarters was out to get him, meant that he saw every setback as intentional sabotage and a personal snipe, rather than just a natural flow of warfare. He was never outright insubordinate when it came to his orders, except perhaps in the case of not marching into Bohemia, but even here he was right to be cautious. But his general attitude throughout the campaign must have become an annoyance to both Napoleon and Imperial headquarters. For his part, Napoleon can perhaps be criticised for not recognising that of course a character such as Bernadotte would react in the manner that he did at being given such a command, and if he had listened and acted upon the Marshal's feedback and thus reinforced Ninth Corps, then perhaps the disaster at Aderklaa would not have occurred. It must be remembered, however, that Napoleon was dealing with not just Bernadotte, but with at least 10 other corps in a campaign which was essentially being improvised from day one. Whilst Bernadotte was writing complaints, Napoleon was trying to get his army out of a messy situation and then end the campaign as swiftly as possible. At the Battle of Wagram itself, Bernadotte again let himself down, firstly in his mindless attack upon Wagram in the evening, and then in his surrendering of the important village of Auerstadt during the night without informing Napoleon. The routing of his corps was in my opinion beyond his control at that point, but his criticisms of Napoleon were particularly ill-advised, especially his questioning of the ability of the commander-in-chief on the eve of battle, which was not exactly going to help morale. Despite all of this, he probably would still have remained in command until the conclusion of the campaign, but his further comments, implying that his troops wouldn't get their deserved praise because he was their commander, along with the questionable order of the day, were finally enough to break Napoleon, who was I think quite generous to enable him the excuse of ill health in order to save face. The printing of the order of the day in the German press was seemingly not planned or assisted in any way by Bernadotte, but unfortunately only further alienated him from both Napoleon and the French army as a whole, especially the marshals. Although Bernadotte would soon be in command again, I do think that these events were a genuine turning point in his relationship with Napoleon, a breakdown which would curiously lead to Bernadotte securing a crown of his own, but that is a story for another time. Until then, thanks for watching.